Chapter 20 of The Boy Knight, A Tale of the Crusades. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Boy Knight, A Tale of the Crusades, by G.A. Henty. Chapter 20, Under the Greenwood. At the end of a month, news came from England that Sir Baldwin of Bethune had returned there, bearing the news that the king had been arrested at Gordes, only 2 days' journey north of the Adriatic, that he had been recognized and at once captured. He had offered no resistance, finding indeed that it would be hopeless so to do. Sir Baldwin had been permitted to depart without molestation. He believed that the folk into whose hands he had fallen were retainers of the Archduke John. This news, although sad in itself, was yet in some degree reassuring to the Duke and his wife, for they felt that while the followers of Conrad of Montferrat would not hesitate to put King Richard to death should he fall into their hands, the Archduke John would not dare to bring upon himself the indignation of Europe by such treatment of his royal captive. Cuthbert at once determined to return to England to see Sir Baldwin, and to ascertain what steps were being taken for the discovery of the prison in which King Richard was confined, and for his release therefrom, and also to establish himself in his new dignity as Earl of Evesham. Therefore, bidding adieu to the Duke and Duchess, he started north. The Duke furnished him with letters of introduction to the princes through whose countries he would travel, and again crossing the Rhine, he journeyed through the territories of the Dukes of Cleves and Brabant, and reached the mouth of Scheldt without interruption. There taking ship, he sailed for London. It was a long and stormy passage between the mouth of the Scheldt and London. The vessel in which Cuthbert had shipped was old and somewhat unseaworthy, and several times in the fierce of the gale all on board gave up hope for their lives. At last, however, they reached the mouth of the Thames, and dropping up with the tide, reached London 8 days after their embarkation. The noble charger which the King of Saxony had presented to Cuthbert had suffered greatly, and he feared at one time that the poor animal would succumb to the effects of the tempest. However, after entering into smooth water, it recovered itself, and on landing near the tower he found that it was able to support his weight. Canute and the archers were, like Cuthbert, delighted to have their feet again upon English soil, and although London did not now strike them with the same wonder which it would have done had they first visited it before starting on their journey, for in many respects it was greatly behind some of the continental cities, yet the feeling of home and the pleasure of being able to understand the conversation of those around them made the poor fellows almost beside themselves with joy. Beyond the main political incidents, Cuthbert had heard little of what had passed in England since his departure, and putting up at a hostelry, he inquired of the host whether Sir Baldwin of Bethune was in London, or whether he was away on his estates. The landlord did not know. There were, he said, but few nobles at court, and London was never so dull as at present. As Cuthbert did not wish his coming home to be known to John until he had learned something of the position of affairs, he dispatched Canute to the Tower to inquire privately of some of the officials about the place whether Sir Baldwin was there. Canute soon returned with the news that he had not been at the court since his return from the Holy Land, and that he was living at his castle down in Dorsetshire. After some hesitation, Cuthbert resolved to set out to see his friend, and after 6 days' travel he arrived at the castle of the knight. Sir Baldwin received him with immense joy. He had not heard of him since they parted at Zara, and he feared that a fate similar to that which had befallen King Richard had overtaken Cuthbert, even if he were still alive. "Have you seen aught of the king, our master?" the good knight inquired. "Nothing," Cuthbert said. "I know no more than yourself. Indeed, I hoped to have learned something from you as to the king. I was separated from him at Gordes, and while he was taken a prisoner to the Archduke, I was allowed to pursue my way. I had many difficulties and dangers, and was some weeks in finding my way back. Nothing was known of the king when I returned. Indeed, I was the first bearer of any definite news concerning him since the day when he sailed from Acre. 3 weeks ago, as you may have learned, the news came that he is now detained in captivity by the Emperor, who demanded his delivery by the Archduke John, into whose hands he first fell, but where he is no one exactly knows. The news has created an immense excitement in the kingdom, and all are resolved to sacrifice any of their treasures which may be demanded in order to satisfy the ransom which the recreant emperor has placed upon the king. Shame is it indeed that a Christian sovereign should hold another in captivity. Still more when that other was returning through his dominions as a crusader coming from the Holy Land, when his person should be safe, even to his deadliest enemy. It has long been suspected that he was in the hands either of the emperor or of the archduke, and throughout Europe the feeling of indignation has been strong, and I doubt not, now that the truth is known, this feeling will be stronger than ever. But now that it is known, Cuthbert said, I suppose there will be no delay in ransoming the king. There will be no delay in raising the ransom, Sir Baldwin said. But the kingdom is very impoverished by war, by the exactions of Prince John, and by those of Langley, who held it for King Richard. He was a royal servant of the king, but an exacting and rapacious prelate. However, I doubt not that the rents of the English nobles will soon be charged with sums sufficient for the ransom, and if this avail not one of them will grudge their silver flagons and vessels to melt down to make the total required. But we must not flatter ourselves that he will obtain his liberty so soon as the money is raised. Prince John has long been yearning for sovereignty. He has long exercised the real, if not the nominal power, and he has been intriguing with the Pope and Philip of France for their support for his seizing the crown. He will throw every obstacle in the way, and as we may be sure, will Philip of France, Richard's deadly enemy. And now about yourself, Sir Cuthbert. Tell me what has befallen you since we last met. Cuthbert related the adventures which had befallen him, and heard those of Sir Baldwin. You have not, I suppose, the latter remarked, as yet seen Prince John? No, Cuthbert replied. I thought it better to come down to ask you to advise me on the position of affairs before I attempted to see him. You did well, Sir Baldwin said. When I arrived, I found that the proper officials had, according to King Richard's instructions, draw up the patent conferring upon you the lands and title of Earl of Evesham, before leaving Acre, and had received the king's signature to it. This was attested by several of the nobles who were with us, and who returned safely to England. Prince John, however, declared that he should not give any heed to the document, that King Richard's power over this realm had ceased before he made it, and that he should bestow the earldom upon whomsoever he chose. As a matter of fact, it has been given to Sir Rudolph Fleming, a Norman knight and a creature of the prince. The king has also, I hear, promised to him the hand of the young Lady Margaret, when she shall become of marriageable age. At present she is placed in a convent in Worcestershire. The abbess is, I believe, a friend of the late earl, and the girl had been with her for some time previously. Indeed, she went there, I think, when her father left England. This lady was ordered to give up her charge to the guardianship of Sir Rudolph, but she refused to do so, saying that it would not be conveniable for a young lady to be under the guardianship of a bachelor knight, having no lady at the head of his establishment, and that therefore she should retain her, in spite of the orders of the prince. Prince John, I hear, flew into a fury at this, but he did not dare to provoke the anger of the whole of the clergy by ordering the convent to be violated. And indeed, not only would the clergy have been indignant, but many of the great nobles would also have taken their part, for there can be no doubt that the contention of the abbess was reasonable, and there is among all the friends of King Richard a very strong feeling of anger at your having been deprived of the earldom. This, however, has so far not found much vent in words, for as it was uncertain whether you would ever return to claim your rights, it was worth no one's while to embroil himself unnecessarily with the prince on such a subject. God knows that there are subjects enough of dispute between John Lackland and the English barons without any fresh ones arising. The kingdom is in a state of disturbance. There have been several risings against Prince John's authority, but those have been, so far, suppressed. Now that we know where King Richard is, and hope for his return ere very long, it is possible that peace will be maintained. But should treachery prevail, and King Richard's return be prevented, you may be sure that John will not be permitted to mount the throne without the determined resistance of a large number of the nobles." "But," Cuthbert said, "John is not the successor to the throne. Prince Arthur of Brittany was named by King Richard from the first as his successor. He is so by blood and by right, and John can have no pretence to the throne so long as he lives." "That is so," Sir Baldwin said, "but unhappily in England at present might makes right, and you may be sure that at King Richard's death, be it when it may, Prince John will make a bold throw for the throne, and aided as he will be by the Pope and by Philip of France, methinks that his chances are better than those of the young prince. A man's power in warlike times is more than a boy's. He can intrigue and promise and threaten, while a boy must be in the hands of partisans. I fear that Prince Arthur will have troubled times indeed before he mounts the throne of England. Should Richard survive until he becomes of age to take the field himself and head armies, he may succeed, for all speak well of him as a boy of singular sweetness of disposition, while Prince John is detested by all save those who flatter and live by him. But enough for the present of politics, Cuthbert. Let us now to table. It is long since we two feasted together, and indeed such meals as we took in the Holy Land could scarcely have been called feasts. A boar's head and a good roasted capon are worthy all the strange dishes that we had there. I always misdoubted the meat, which seemed to me to smack and flavour of the Saracens, and I never could bring myself to inquire whence that strange food was obtained. A stoup of English ale, too, is worth all the Cyprus wines, especially when the Cyprus wines are half full of the sand of the desert. Pah! It makes my throat dry to think of those horrible meals. So you have brought Canute and your 4 archers safely back with you?" "Yes," Cuthbert said, smiling. "But they were, I can assure you, a heavy weight on me, in spite of their faithfulness and fidelity. Their ignorance of the language brought most of my troubles upon me, and Canute had something of the nature of a bull in him. There are certain things which he cannot stomach, and when he seeth them he rageth like a wild beast, regardless altogether of safety or convenience." In the evening the 2 knights again talked over the course which Cuthbert should adopt. The elder knight's opinion was that his young friend had best formally claim the title by writing to the king at arms, and should also announce his return to Prince John, signing himself Sir Cuthbert, Earl of Evesham, but that, in the present state of things, it would be unwise for him to attempt to regain his position. Should, as was certain to be the case, Prince John refuse to recognize him. "You are young yet," Sir Baldwin said, "not 18, I think, and can afford to wait, at any rate, to see whether King Richard returns. Should he come back, he will see all these wrongs are righted, and one of his first cares would assuredly be to cast this usurper out of his stolen dignities. How old is the Lady Margaret?" "She is 15, Cuthbert said. She was 3 years younger than I." "I wish she had been younger," Sir Baldwin said. "At 15 she is not by custom fairly marriageable, but men can strain these points when they choose, and I fear that the news of your coming will hasten both the Prince and Sir Rudolph in their determination to strengthen the claim of this usurper by marriage with the heiress of Evesham. The Lady Margaret and her friends can of course claim that she is a royal ward, and that as such the king alone can dispose of her person and estates. But unfortunately force overrides argument." "But surely," Cuthbert said, "they will never venture to take her by force from the convent." "They venture a great many strange things in England now," Sir Baldwin said, "and Worcester is perilously near to Evesham. With a clump of 20 spears, Sir Rudolph might break into the convent and carry off the young lady, and marry her by force, and although the church might cry out, crying would be of little avail when the deed was done, and a handsome present on the part of Sir Rudolph might go far to shut the mouths of many of the complainants, especially as he will be able to say that he has the king's sanction for what he did. Methinks, Cuthbert said, that if such be the case, it would be perilous indeed to wait for King Richard's return. Assuredly, Sir Rudolph would not tarry until she attained the age of 17, and it may well be that 2 years may yet pass before King Richard comes back. It seems to me the wiser part will be that I should give Prince John no notice that I am in England. As you say, such notice would be of no avail in recovering my lands and title, but it would put the prince upon his guard, and assuredly he and his minions would press forward their measures to obtain possession of the person of the Lady Margaret, while on the other hand no harm could come of my maintaining silence. I think that you are right, Sir Cuthbert. It were indeed best that your enemy should suppose you either dead or in some dungeon in the Tyrol. What would you then do? I would return to my old home, Cuthbert said. My lady mother is, I trust, still alive, but I will not appear at her house, but will take refuge in the forest there. Canute and the archers with him were all at one time outlaws living there, and I doubt not that there are many good men and true still to be found in the woods. Others will assuredly join when they learn that Canute is there, and that they are wanted to strike a blow for my rights. I shall then bide my time. I will keep a strict watch over the castle and over the convent. As the abbess is a friend and a relative of Lady Margaret's, I may obtain an interview with her, and warn her of the dangers that await her, and ask if she be willing to fulfill the promise of her father and King Richard's will, in accepting me as her husband when due time shall arrive, and whether she will be willing that I should take such steps as I may to deliver her from the persecution of Sir Rudolph. If, as I trust, she assents to this, I will keep a watch over the convent as well as the castle, and can then either attack the latter or carry her off from the former, as the occasion may appear to warrant. There are plenty of snug cottages round the forest, where she can remain in concealment in the care of some good farmer's wife for months, and we shall be close at hand to watch over her. With the aid of the forestmen, Sir Walter took the castle of Sir John of Wortham, and although Evesham is a far grander pile than that, yet methinks it could be carried by a sudden assault, and we know more of war now than we did then. Prince John may deny me the right of being the Earl of Evesham, but methinks before many months I can, if I choose, become its master. Be not too hasty in that matter, Sir Baldwin said. You might capture the castle with the aid of your outlaws, but you could scarcely hold it. The prince has, ere now, with the aid of those faithful to him and his foreign mercenaries, captured stronger holds than that of Evesham, and if you turn his favourite out, you would have a swarm of hornets around you, such as the walls of Evesham could not keep out. It would therefore be worse than useless for you to attempt what would be something like an act of rebellion against Prince John's authority, and would give him what now he has no excuse for, a ground for putting a price upon your head, and cutting it off if he got the opportunity. You might now present yourself boldly at court, and although he might refuse to recognize your title of Earl, yet, as a knight and a crusader who has distinguished himself greatly in the Holy Land, he dare not interfere with your person, for this would be resented by the whole of the chivalry of England. Still, I agree with you that your best course is to keep your return a secret. You will then be unwatched and unnoticed, and your enemies will take their time in carrying their designs into effect. 2 days later, Cuthbert, attended by his faithful retainers, left Sir Baldwin's castle, and travelled by easy stages through Wiltshire and the confines of Gloucestershire up to Worcestershire. He had been supplied by Sir Baldwin with suitable attire for himself and his followers, and now rode as a simple knight, without arms or cognizance, journeying from one part to another. All the crosses and other crusading signs were laid aside, and there was nothing to attract any attention to him upon his passage. Cuthbert had at first thought of going direct to the convent of Worcester and asking for an interview with Lady Margaret, but he reflected that it might be possible that some of the myrmidons of Sir Rudolph might be keeping a watch over that building to see that Lady Margaret was not secretly removed to some other place of refuge, and that the appearance of a knight before its doors would excite comment and suspicion. He therefore avoided the town, and journeyed straight to the forest, where he had so often roamed with Canute and the outlaws. Here he found that matters had but little changed since he was last there. Many of those who had fought with him in the Holy Land, and who had returned by sea, had again taken to the forest, joined by many new men whom the exactions of Sir Rudolph had already goaded into revolt. Canute was received with enthusiasm, and when he presented Cuthbert to them as the rightful heir of Evesham, and the well-known friend of the foresters, their enthusiasm knew no bounds. They at once accepted him as their lord and master, and promised to obey his orders, and to lay down their lives, if necessary, in his cause, as they knew that it was he who had formerly obtained the pardon of the forest band, and who had fought with them in their attack on Wortham Castle. To Cuthbert's great delight he heard that his mother was in good health, although she had for some months been grievously fretting over his disappearance and supposed death. Cuthbert hesitated whether he should proceed at once to see her, but he feared that the shock of his appearance might be too much for her, and that her expressions of joy might make the retainers and others aware of his arrival, and the news might in some way reach the ears of those at the castle. He therefore dispatched Canute to see her, and break the news to her cautiously, and to request her to arrange for a time when she would either see Cuthbert at some place at a distance from the house, or would so arrange that the domestics should be absent, and that he would have an interview with her there unobserved. Canute was absent some hours, and on his return told Cuthbert that he had seen Dame Editha, and that her joy on hearing of her son's safe arrival had caused her no harm, but rather the reverse. The news that King Richard had bestowed upon him the title and lands of Evesham was new to her, and she was astonished indeed to hear of his elevation. Having heard much of the character of the pretending earl, she had great fears for the safety of Cuthbert, should his residence in the neighbourhood get to his ears, and although sure of the fidelity of all her retainers, she feared that in their joy at their young master's return they might let slip some incautious word which would come to the ears of some of those at the castle. She therefore determined to meet him at a distance. She had arranged that upon the following day she would give out that she intended to make a pilgrimage to the shrine of St. Dunstan, which lay at the edge of the forest, to thank him for her recovery from illness, and to pray for the safety of her son. She would be carried thither in a litter, and her journey would excite no comment whatever. She would take with her 4 of her most trusted retainers, and would on her arrival at the shrine send them to a distance, in order to pay her devotions undisturbed. Cuthbert was to be near, and the moment he saw them depart, to enter. This arrangement was carried out, and the joy of Dame Editha at again meeting her son was deep indeed. He had left her a lad of 15. He now returned a youth of nearly 18, stout and strong beyond his age, and looking far older than he was, from the effect of the hot sun of Syria and of the hardships through which he had gone. That he should win his spurs upon the first opportunity the Earl had promised her, and she doubted not that he would soon attain the rank which his father had held, but that he should return to her a belted earl was beyond her wildest thoughts. This, however, was but little in her mind then. It was her son, and not the Earl of Evesham, whom she clasped in her arms. As the interview must necessarily be a short one, Cuthbert gave her but a slight outline of what had happened since they parted, and the conversation then turned upon the present position, and upon the steps which had best be taken. "Your peril is, I fear, as great here as when you were fighting the infidels in the Holy Land," she said. "Sir Rudolph has not been here long, but he has proved himself a cruel and ruthless master. He has driven forth many of the old tenants, and bestowed their lands upon his own servants and retainers. The forest laws he carries out to the full severity, and has hung several men who were caught infringing them. He has laid such heavy burdens on all the tenants that remain that they are fairly ruined, and if he stay here long he will rule over a desert. Did he dream of your presence here, he would carry fire and sword through the forest. It is sad indeed to think that so worthless a knave as this should be a favourite of the ruler of England. But all men say that he is so. Thus, were you to attack him, even did you conquer and kill him, you would have the enmity of Prince John to contend with, and he spareth none, man or woman, who stand in his way. It will be a bad day indeed for England should our good King Richard not return. I will, as you wish me, write to my good cousin, the Lady Abbess of St. Anne's, and will ask that you may have an interview with the Lady Margaret, to hear her wishes and opinions concerning the future, and will pray her to do all that she can to aid your suit with the fair young lady, and to keep her at all events safe from the clutches of the tyrant of Evesham. 3 days later, a boy, employed as a messenger from Dame Editha, brought a note to Cuthbert, saying that she had heard from the Abbess of St. Anne's, who would be glad to receive a visit from Cuthbert. The Abbess had asked his mother to accompany him, but this she left for him to decide. Cuthbert sent back a message in reply that he thought it would be dangerous for her to accompany him, as any spy watching would report her appearance, and inquiries were sure to be set on foot as to her companion. He said that he himself would call at the convent on the following evening after nightfall, and begged her to send word to the abbess to that effect, in order that he might, when he presented himself, be admitted at once. End of Chapter 20. Recording by JoelBrenner, October 8, 2025, Crittinger, Iowa. Chapter 21 of The Boy Knight, A Tale of the Crusades. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Boy Knight, A Tale of the Crusades, by G.A. Henty. Chapter 21. An Attempt on a Convent. Upon the following evening, Cuthbert proceeded to Worcester. He left his horse some little distance outside the town, and entered on foot. Having no apprehension of an attack, he had left all his pieces of armor behind, and was in the quiet garb of a citizen. Canute attended him, for that worthy follower considered himself as responsible that no harm of any sort should befall his young master. The consequences of his own imprudence in the Tyrol were ever before his mind, and he determined that from henceforth there should be no want of care on his part. He accompanied Cuthbert to within a short distance of the convent, and took up his position in the shade of a house, whence he could watch, should any one appear to be observing Cuthbert's entrance. Upon ringing the bell, Cuthbert told the porteress, as had been arranged, that he had called on a message from Dame Editha, and he was immediately ushered into the parlor of the convent, where, a minute or two later, he was joined by the Lady Abbess. He had when young been frequently to the convent, and had always been kindly received. "I am indeed glad to see you, Sir Cuthbert," she said, "though I certainly should not have recognized the lad who used to come here with my cousin in the stalwart young knight I see before me. You are indeed changed and improved. Who would think that my gossip Editha's son would come to be the Earl of Evesham? The Lady Margaret is eager to see you, but I think that you exaggerate the dangers of her residence here. I cannot think that even a minion of Prince John would dare to violate the sanctity of a convent." "I fear, good mother," Cuthbert said, "that when ambition and greed are in one scale, reverence for the Holy Church will not weigh much in the other. Had King Richard been killed upon his way home, or so long as nothing was heard of him, Sir Rudolph might have been content to allow matters to remain as they were, until at least Lady Margaret attained an age which would justify him in demanding that the espousal should be carried out. But the news which has now positively been ascertained, that the king is in the hands of the emperor, and the knowledge that sooner or later his freedom will be obtained, will hasten the friends of the usurper to make the most of their advantage. He knows that the king would at once, upon his return, annul the nomination of Sir Rudolph to the earldom which had previously been bestowed upon me. But he may well think that if before that time he can secure in marriage the person of the late Earl's daughter, no small share of the domains may be allotted to him as her dowry, even if he be obliged to lay by his borrowed honours. You will, unless I am greatly mistaken, hear from him before long." The abbess looked grave. "There is much in what you say, Sir Cuthbert, and indeed a certain confirmation is given to it by the fact that only yesterday I received a letter from Sir Rudolph, urging that now the Lady Margaret is past the age of 15, and may therefore be considered marriageable, the will of the prince should be carried into effect, and that she should for the present be committed to the charge of the Lady Clara Bulger, who is the wife of a friend and associate of Sir Rudolph. He says that he should not wish to press the marriage until she attains the age of 16, but that it were well that his future wife should become accustomed to the outside world, so as to take her place as castellan of Evesham with a dignity befitting the position. I wrote at once to him saying that in another year it would, in my poor judgment, be quite time to think about such worldly matters. That at the present the Lady Margaret was receiving an education suitable to her rank, that she was happy here, and that unless constrained by force, of which I said I could not suppose that any possibility existed, I should not surrender the Lady Margaret into any hands whatsoever, unless indeed I received the commands of her lawful guardian, King Richard. You said well, Holy Mother, Sir Cuthbert said, but you see the hawks scent the danger from afar, and are moving uneasily already. Whether they consider it so pressing that they will dare to profane the convent, I know not. But I am sure that, should they do so, they will not hesitate a moment at the thought of the anger of the Church. Prince John has already shown that he is ready, if need be, to oppose the authority of the Holy Father, and he may well, therefore, despise any local wrath that might be excited by an action which he can himself disavow, and for which, even at the worst, he need only inflict some nominal punishment upon his vassal. Bethink thee, lady, whether it would not be safer to send the Lady Margaret to the care of some person, where she may be concealed from the search of Sir Rudolph. I would gladly do so, the abbess said, did I know of such a person or such a place, but it is difficult indeed for a young lady of rank to be concealed from such sharp searchers as Sir Rudolph would be certain to place upon her track. Your proposal that she should take refuge in the house of some small franklin near the forest, I cannot agree to. In the first place, it would demean her to be so placed, and in the second, we could never be sure that the report of her residence there might not reach the ears of Sir Rudolph. As a last resource, of course, such a step would be justifiable, but not until at least overt outrages have been attempted. Now, I will call Lady Margaret in. The young girl entered with an air of frank gladness, but was startled at the alteration which had taken place in her former playfellow, and paused and looked at the abbess, as if inquiring whether this could be really the Cuthbert she had known. Lady Margaret was 15 in years, but she looked much younger. The quiet seclusion in which she had lived in the convent had kept her from approaching that maturity which, as an earl's daughter, brought up in the stir and bustle of a castle, she would doubtless have attained. This is indeed Sir Cuthbert, the abbess said, your old playfellow, and the husband destined for you by your father and by the will of the king. Struck with a new timidity, the girl advanced, and according to the custom of the times, held up her cheek to be kissed. Cuthbert was almost as timid as herself. I feel, Lady Margaret, he said, a deep sense of my own unworthiness of the kindness and honor which the dear lord your father bestowed upon me. And were it not that many dangers threaten, and that it were difficult under the circumstances to find one more worthy of you, I would gladly resign you into the hands of such a one were it for your happiness. But believe me that the recollection of your face has animated me in many of the scenes of danger in which I have been placed, and although even in fancy my thoughts scarcely ventured to rise so high, yet I felt as a true knight might feel for the lady of his love. I always liked you, Sir Cuthbert, the girl said frankly, better than anyone else next to my father, and gladly submit myself to his will. My own inclinations, indeed, so far as is maidenly, go with his. These are troubled times, she said anxiously. "And our Holy Mother tells me that you fear some danger is overhanging me." "I trust that the danger may not be imminent," Cuthbert answered. "But knowing the unscrupulous nature of the false Earl of Evesham, I fear that the news that King Richard is found will bestir him to early action. But you can rely, dear lady, on a careful watch being kept over you night and day, and should any attempt be made to carry you away, or to put force upon you, be assured that assistance will be at hand. Even should any attempt succeed, do not lose heart, for rescue will certainly be attempted, and I must be dead, and my faithful followers crushed, before you can become the bride of Sir Rudolph." Then turning to other subjects, he talked to her of the life he had led since he last saw her. He told her of the last moments of her father, and of the gallant deeds he had done in the Holy Land. After waiting for 2 hours, the abbess judged that the time for separation had arrived, and Cuthbert, taking a respectful adieu of his young mistress, and receiving the benediction of the abbess, departed. He found Canute on guard at the point where he had left him. "Have you seen aught to give rise to suspicion?" Cuthbert asked. "Yes," Canute said. "The place is undoubtedly watched. Just after you had entered, a man came from that house yonder and went up to the gate, as if he would fain learn by staring at its iron adornments the nature of him who had passed in. Then he re-entered his house, and if I mistake not is still on the watch at that casement. If we stand here for a minute or two, perchance he may come out to see what delays you in this dark corner, in which case I may well give him a clout with my axe, which will settle his prying." "Better not," Cuthbert said. "We can retire round this corner and so avoid his observation, and were his body found slain here, suspicion would be at once excited in the mind of his employer. At present he can have no ground for any report which may make the knight uneasy, for he can but know that a gentleman has entered, and remained for 2 hours at the convent, and he will in no way connect my visit with the Lady Margaret." They had just turned the corner which Cuthbert indicated, when a man came up rapidly behind them, and almost brushed them as he passed, half turning round and trying to gaze into their faces. Canute at once assumed the aspect of an intoxicated person, and stretching forth his foot, with a dexterous shove pushed the stranger into the gutter. The latter rose with a fierce cry of anger, but Canute with a blow of his heavy fist again stretched him on the ground, this time to remain quiet until they had walked on and passed out of sight. "A meddling fool," Canute grumbled. "He will not, methinks, have much to report to Sir Rudolph this time. Had I thought that he had seen your face, I would have cleft his skull with no more hesitation than I send an arrow into the brain of a stag in the forest." As they journeyed along, Cuthbert informed Canute of what the abbess had told him, and the latter agreed that a watch must be placed on the convent, and that a force must be kept as near as possible at hand, so as to defeat any attempt which might be made. The next day, one of the forestmen, who had been a peaceable citizen, but who had been charged with using false weights, and had been condemned to lose his ears, repaired to Worcester. His person was unknown there, as he had before lived at Gloucester. He hired a house in the square in which the convent was situated, giving out that he desired to open a house of business for the sale of silks, and for articles from the Low Countries. As he paid down earnest money for the rent, no suspicion whatever was excited. He at once took up his abode there, having with him 2 stout serving men and a prentice boy, and from that time 2 sets of watchers observed without ceasing what passed at the convent of St. Anne. At a distance of half a mile from the road leading between Worcester and Evesham stood a grange, which had for some time been disused, the ground belonging to it having been sequestrated and given to the lord of an adjoining estate, who did not care to have the grange occupied. In this 10 men, headed by Canute, took up their residence, blocking up the window of the hall with hangings, so that the light of the fire kindled within would not be observed. 2 months passed on without any incident of importance. The feeling between the outlaws in the forest and the retainers of the false Earl of Evesham was becoming much embittered. Several times the foresters of the latter, attempting pursuit of men charged with breaking the game laws, were roughly handled. These, on making their report, were sent back again, supported by a force of footmen. But these too were driven back, and the authority of Sir Rudolph was openly defied. Gradually it came to his ears that the outlaws were commanded by a man who had been their leader in times gone by, but who had been pardoned, and had with a large number of his band taken service in the army of the Crusaders. Also that there was present a stranger, whose manner and the deference paid to him by Canute proclaimed him to be of gentle blood. This news awakened grave uneasiness on the part of Sir Rudolph. The knight caused inquiries to be made, and ascertained that Canute had been especially attached to the young Cuthbert, and that he had fought under the Earl of Evesham's banner. It seemed possible then that with him had returned the claimant for the earldom, and in that case Sir Rudolph felt that danger menaced him. For the bravery of the Earl of Evesham's adopted son had been widely spoken of by those who had returned from the Holy Land. Sir Rudolph was a man of 40, tall and dark, with Norman features. He held the Saxons in utter contempt, and treated them as beings solely created to till the land for the benefit of their Norman lords. He was brave and fearless, and altogether free from the superstition of the times. Even the threats of the Pope, which, although Prince John defied them, yet terrified him at heart, were derided by his follower, who feared no one thing in the world, save perhaps the return of King Richard from captivity. No sooner had the suspicion that his rival was in the neighborhood possessed him, than he determined that one of two things must be carried out. Either Sir Cuthbert must be killed, or the Lady Margaret must be carried off and forced to accept him as her husband. First he endeavored to force Sir Cuthbert to declare himself, and to trust to his own arm to put an end to his rival. To that end he caused a proclamation to be written, and to be affixed to the door of the village church at the fair of Evesham. Canute and several of his followers were there, all quietly dressed as yeomen. Seeing a crowd round the door of the church, he pressed forward. Being himself unable to read writing, he asked one of the burgesses what was written upon the paper which caused such excitement. "It is," the burgess said, "in the nature of a cartel or challenge from our present lord, Sir Rudolph. He says that it having come to his ears that a Saxon serf, calling himself Sir Cuthbert, Earl of Evesham, is lurking in the woods and consorting with outlaws and robbers. He challenges him to appear, saying that he will himself, grievously although he would demean himself by so doing, yet condescend to meet him in the lists with sword and battle-axe, and to prove upon his body the falseness of his averments. Men marvel much," the burgess continued, "at this condescension on the Earl's part. We have heard, indeed, that King Richard, before he sailed for England, did, at the death of the late good Earl, bestow his rank and the domains of Evesham upon Sir Cuthbert, the son of the Dame Editha. Whether it be true or not, we cannot say, but it seems strange that such honor should have been bestowed upon one so young. In birth, indeed, he might aspire to the rank, since his father, Sir Walter, was a brave knight, and the mother, Dame Editha, was of good Saxon blood, and descended from those who held Evesham before the arrival of the Normans." Canute's first impulse was to stride forward and to tear down the proclamation. But the remembrance of his solemn determination not in future to act rashly came across him, and he decided to take no steps until he had reported the facts to his master, and taken his counsel thereon. Cuthbert received the news with much indignation. "There is naught that I should like better," he said, "than to try my strength against that of this false traitor, but although I have proved my arm against the Saracens, I think not that it is yet strong enough to cope against a man who, whatsoever be his faults, is said to be a valiant knight. But that would not deter me from attempting the task. It is craftily done on the part of Sir Rudolph. He reckons that if I appear he will kill me, that if I do not appear I shall be branded as a coward, and my claims brought into disrepute. It may be, too, that it is a mere ruse to discover if I be in the neighborhood. Some rumors thereof may have reached him, and he has taken this course to determine upon their truth. He has gone too far, and honest men will see in the cartel itself a sign that he misdoubts him that my claims are just. For were I, as he says, a Saxon serf, be sure that he would not condescend to meet me in the lists as he proposes. I trust that the time will come when I may do so, but at present I will submit to his insult rather than imperil the success of our plans, and what is of far greater importance, the safety and happiness of the Lady Margaret, who, did aught befall me, would assuredly fall into his hands. After some thought, however, Cuthbert drew up an answer to the knight's proclamation. He did not in this speak in his own name, but wrote as if the document were the work of Canute. It was worded as follows: I, Canute, a free Saxon and a leader of bowmen under King Richard in the Holy Land, do hereby pronounce and declare the statements of Sir Rudolph, miscalled the Earl of Evesham, to be false and calumnious. The earldom was, as Rudolph well knows, and as can be proved by many nobles and gentlemen of repute who were present with King Richard, granted to Sir Cuthbert, King Richard's true and faithful follower. When the time shall come, Sir Cuthbert will doubtless be ready to prove his rights. But at present right has no force in England, and until the coming of our good King Richard must remain in abeyance. Until then I support the title of Sir Cuthbert, and do hereby declare Sir Rudolph a false and perjured knight, and warn him that if he falls into my hands, it will fare but badly with him, as I know that it will fare but badly with me, should I come into his. At nightfall the cartel of Sir Rudolph was torn down from the church, and that of Canute affixed in its place. The reading thereof caused great astonishment in Evesham, and the rage of Sir Rudolph when the news came to his ears was very great. Cuthbert was sure that this affair would quicken the intentions of Sir Rudolph with regard to the Lady Margaret, and he received confirmation of this in a letter which the abbess sent him, saying that she had received another missive from Sir Rudolph, authoritatively demanding in the king's name the instant surrender of Lady Margaret to him. That night 40 archers stole one by one quietly into Worcestershire, entering the town before the gates were shut, and so mingling with the citizens that they were unobserved. When it was quite dark, they quietly took their way one by one to the square in which stood the convent, and were admitted into the shop of Master Nicholas, the silk mercer. The house was a large one, with its floors overhanging each the one beneath it, as was the custom of the time, and with large casements running the whole width of the house. The mercer had laid by a goodly store of provisions, and for 3 days the troop, large as it was accommodated there. Cuthbert himself was with them, Canute remaining at the Grange with the 10 men originally sent there. On the 3rd day Sir Rudolph, with a number of knights and men-at-arms, arrived in the town, giving out that he was passing northward, but he would abide that night at the hostelry. A great many of his men-at-arms did, as those on the watch observed, enter one by one into the town. The people of Worcester were somewhat surprised at this large accompaniment of the Earl, but thought no harm. The Abbess of St. Anne's, however, was greatly terrified, as she feared that some evil design might be intended against her. She was, however, reassured in the evening by a message brought by a boy, to the effect that succor would be near whatsoever happened. At midnight, a sudden uproar was heard in the streets of Worcester. A party of men fell upon the burgesses guarding the gate of the town, disarmed them, and took possession of it. At the same time, those who had put up at the hostelry with Sir Rudolph suddenly mounted their horses, and with a great clatter rode down the streets to the convent of St. Anne. Numbers of men on foot also joined, and some 60 in all suddenly appeared before the great gate of the convent. With a thundering noise they knocked at the door, and upon the grating being opened, Sir Rudolph himself told the porteress, who looked through it, that she was to go at once to the abbess, and order her to surrender the body of the Lady Margaret to him, in accordance with the order of Prince John. adding that if within the space of 5 minutes the order was not complied with, he would burst in the gates of the convent and take her for himself. In another minute a casement opened above, and the abbess herself appeared. "Rash man," she said to Sir Rudolph, "I warn you against committing the sin of sacrilege. Neither the orders of Prince John nor of any other potentate can override the rights of the Holy Church. And should you venture to lay the hand of force upon this convent, you will be placed under the anathema of the Church, and its spiritual terrors will be directed against you." "I am prepared to risk that, Holy Mother," Sir Rudolph said with a laugh, "so long as I am obeying the orders of my prince. I care not for those of any foreign potentate, be he pope or be he emperor. 3 minutes of the time I gave you have elapsed, and unless within 2 more the Lady Margaret appears at the gate, I will batter it down, and you may think yourself lucky if I do not order my men to set light to it and to smoke you out of your hole." The abbess closed the window, and as she did so, the long row of casements in the house of Master Nicholas were opened from top to bottom, and a volley of 60 cloth-yard arrows was poured into the group closely standing round the gate. Many fell, killed outright, and shouts of rage and pain were heard rising. Furious at this unexpected attack, Sir Rudolph turned and commanded those with him to attack the house whence this volley of missiles had come. But even while he spoke, another flight of arrows, even more deadly than the last, was poured forth. One of the knights standing by the side of Sir Rudolph fell, shot through the brain. Very many of the common men, undefended by harness, fell shot through and through, and an arrow piercing the joint of the armor of Sir Rudolph wounded him in the shoulder. In vain the knight stormed and raged and ordered his men to advance. The suddenness of the attack seemed to his superstitious followers a direct answer from heaven to the words of the abbess. Their number was already seriously lessened, and those who were in case to do so at once took flight and scattered through the city, making for the gate, which had already been seized by Sir Rudolph's men. Finding himself alone with only a few of his knights and principal men-at-arms remaining, while the storm of arrows continued unabated, Sir Rudolph was forced to order his men to retreat with many fierce threats of the vengeance which he would hereafter take. End of Chapter 21. Read by JoelBrenner. November 13th, 2025. Grettinger, Iowa.
Chapter 22 of The Boy Knight, A Tale of the Crusades. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Douglas Allen. The Boy Knight, A Tale of the Crusades by G.A. Henty. Chapter 22. A Dastardly Stratagem. The return of Sir Rudolph's party to Evesham was not unmarked by incident, for as they passed along the road, from an ambush in a wood other archers, whose numbers they could not discover, shot hard upon them, and many fell there who had escaped from the square at Worcester. When the list was called upon the arrival at the castle, it was found that no less than 30 of those who had set out were missing, while many others were grievously wounded. The noise of the tumult in the square of the convent aroused the whole town of Worcester. Alarm bells were rung, and the burgesses, hastily arming themselves, poured into the streets. Directed by the sound, they made their way to the square, and were astonished at finding it entirely deserted, save for some 20 men lying dead or dying in front of the gate of the convent, pierced with long arrows. They speedily found that Sir Rudolph and his troop had departed, and further inquiry revealed the fact that the burgher guard at one of the gates had been overpowered and were prisoners in the watchroom. These could only say that they were suddenly seized, all being asleep save the one absolutely on guard. They knew nothing more than that a few minutes later there was a great clatter of horsemen and men on foot leaving the city. Unable to find any solution to this singular circumstance, but satisfied that Sir Rudolph had departed, and that no more disturbance was likely to arise that night. The burgesses again betook themselves to their beds, having closed the gates, and placed a strong guard over them, determining next morning to sift the affair to the bottom. In the morning the leading burgesses met in council, and finding none who could give them any information, the mayor and 2 of the councillors repaired to the convent, where they asked for an interview with the lady abbess. Mightily indignant were they at hearing that Sir Rudolph had attempted to break into the convent and to carry off a boarder residing there, but the abbess herself could give them no further news. She said that after she retired from the window she heard great shouts and cries, and that almost immediately afterward the whole of the party in front hastily retired. That Sir Rudolph had been attacked by a party of archers was evident, but whence they had shot, or how they had come upon the spot at the time, or whither they had gone, were mysteries that could not be solved. In the search which the authorities made, however, it was discovered that the house of the draper, Master Nicholas, was closed. Finding that summonses to open were unanswered, the door was broken in, and the premises were found in confusion. No goods of any kind were discovered there, but many bales filled with dried leaves, bark of trees, and other worthless matters. Such goods as had been displayed in the window had clearly been carried away. Searching the house, they found signs that a considerable number of men had been concealed there, and although not knowing whence the body of archers could have come, they concluded that those who defeated the attempt of Sir Rudolph must have been hidden in the draper's house. The singularity of this incident gave rise to great excitement, but the indignation against Sir Rudolph was in no way lessened by the fact that his attempt had been defeated, not by the townsmen themselves, but by some unknown force. After much consultation on the part of the council, it was resolved that a deputation, consisting of the mayor and the 5 senior councillors, should resort to London, and there demand from the prince redress for the injury put upon their town by Sir Rudolph. These worthy merchants betook themselves to London by easy stages, and upon their arrival there were kept for some days before they could obtain an interview with King John. When they appeared before him and commenced telling their story, the prince fell into a sudden rage. "I have heard of this matter before," he said, "and am mightily angry with the people of Worcester, inasmuch as they have dared to interfere to prevent the carrying out of my commands. The Earl of Evesham has written to me, that thinking to scare the Abbess of St. Anne's into a compliance with the commands which I had laid upon her, and to secure the delivery of a contumacious ward of the crown, he had pretended to use force, having, however, no idea of carrying his threats into effect. When, as he doubted not, the abbess was on the point of yielding up the ward, the good knight was suddenly set upon by the rascals of the town, who slew some of his companions and followers, and did grievously ill-treat the remainder. This, said the prince, you now pretend was done by a party of men of whose presence in the town you had no cognizance. Your good sense must be small, if you think that I should believe such a tale as this. It is your rascaldom at Worcester which interfered to prevent my will being carried out, and I have a goodly mind to order the troop of Sir Charles Everest, which is now marching toward Evesham, to sack the town, as a punishment for its rebellion. As, however, I am willing to believe that you and the better class of burgesses were in ignorance of the doings of the rougher kind, I will extend mercy toward the city, and will merely inflict a fine of 3,000 golden marks upon it." The mayor attempted humbly to explain and to entreat, but the prince was seized with a sudden passion, and threatened, if he said more, he would at once cast him and his fellows into durance. Therefore, sadly crestfallen at the result of their mission, the mayor and councillors returned to Worcester, where their report caused great consternation. This was heightened by the fact that upon the following day Sir Charles Everest, with 500 mercenaries of the prince, together with Sir Rudolph and his following, and several other barons favorable to the cause of the prince, were heard to be approaching the town. Worcester was capable of making a stout defense, but seeing that no help was likely to be forthcoming, and fearing the utter ruin of the town should it be taken by storm, the council, after sitting many hours in deliberation, determined to raise the money required to pay the fine inflicted by the prince. The bolder sort were greatly averse to this decision, especially as a letter had been received, signed Cuthbert, Earl of Evesham, offering, should the townspeople decide to resist the unjust demands of Prince John, to enter the town with 150 archers to take part in its defense. With this force, as the more ardent spirits urged, the defeat of any attempt to carry it by storm would be assured. But the graver men argued that even if defeated for the first time, further attempts would be made, and as it was likely that King Richard would not return for a long time, and that Prince John might become sovereign of England, sooner or later the town must be taken, and, in any case, its trade would for a long time be destroyed, and great suffering inflicted upon all. Therefore, that it was better to pay the fine now than to risk all these evils, and perhaps the infliction of a heavier impost upon them. The abbess was kept informed by friends in the council of the course of the proceedings. She had in the meantime had another interview with Sir Cuthbert, and had determined, seeing that Prince John openly supported the doings of his minion, it would be better to remove the Lady Margaret to some other place, as no one could say how the affair might terminate. And with 500 mercenaries at his back, Sir Rudolph would be so completely master of the city that he would be able in broad daylight, did he choose, to force the gates of the convent and carry off the king's ward. Accordingly, 2 days before the arrival of the force before the walls of Worcester, Lady Margaret left the convent by a postern gate in the rear, late in the evening. She was attended by 2 of the sisters, both of whom, as well as herself, were dressed as country women. Mules were in readiness outside the city gates, and here Sir Cuthbert, with an escort of archers, was ready to attend them. They travelled all night, and arrived in the morning at a small convent situated 5 miles from the city of Hereford. The abbess here was a cousin of the superior of St. Anne's, and had already consented to receive Lady Margaret. Leaving her at the door, and promising that, as far as possible, he would keep watch over her, and that even in the worst she need never despair, Sir Cuthbert left her and returned to the forest. The band there assembled varied considerably in numbers, for provisions could not be found continually for a large body of men. The forest was indeed very extensive, and the number of deer therein large. Still, for the feeding of 150 men, many animals are required, and other food. The Franklins in the neighborhood were all hostile to Sir Rudolph, whom they regarded as a cruel tyrant, and did their utmost in the way of supplies for those in the forest. Their resources, however, were limited, and it was found necessary to scatter the force, and for a number of them to take up their residence in places a short distance away, 40 only remaining permanently on guard. Sir Rudolph and his friends entered Worcester, and there received with great hauteur the apologies of the mayor and council, and the assurance that the townspeople were in no wise concerned in the attack made upon him. To this he pretended disbelief. The fine demanded was paid, the principal portion in gold, the rest in bills signed by the leading merchants of the place, for after every effort it had been found impossible to collect such a sum within the city. The day after he arrived, he again renewed his demand to the abbess for the surrender of the Lady Margaret. This time, however, coming to her attended only by 2 squires, and by a pursuivant bearing the king's order for the delivery of the damsel. The abbess met him at the gate and informed him that the Lady Margaret was no longer in her charge. Finding, she said in a fearless tone, that the holy walls of this convent were insufficient to restrain lawless men, and fearing that these might be tempted to acts of sacrilege, which might bring down upon them the wrath of the church and the destruction of their souls, I have sent her away. Whither has she gone? Sir Rudolph demanded, half mad with passion. That I decline to say, the Lady Abbess replied. She is in good hands, and when King Richard returns, his ward shall be delivered to him at once. Will you take oath upon the Bible that she is not within these walls? Sir Rudolph exclaimed. My word is sufficient, the Lady Abbess replied calmly. But should it be necessary, I should be ready to swear upon the relics that she is not here. A few hours later, Sir Rudolph, attended by his own party and by 100 of Sir Charles Everest's mercenaries, returned to his castle. 3 days afterward, as Cuthbert was sitting at a rude but hearty meal in the forest, surrounded by Canute and his followers, a hind entered breathless. Cuthbert at once recognized him as one of the servitors of his mother. What is it? He exclaimed, leaping to his feet. Terrible news, Master Cuthbert, terrible news, exclaimed the man. The wicked Earl came down this morning with 50 of his men, set fire to the house and all its buildings and stacks, and has carried off the lady, your mother, a prisoner to the castle, on a charge, as he said, of harboring traitors. A cry of fury broke from Canute and his men. The false traitor shall bitterly regret this outrage, Cuthbert exclaimed. He had in the first excitement seized his arms, and his followers snatched up their bows, as if for instant warfare. A few moments' reflection, however, showed to Cuthbert the impossibility of attacking a fortress like Evesham, garrisoned by a strong body of well-armed men, with only the archers of the forest, without implements necessary for such an assault. Send at once, Canute, he said, and call in all the band. We cannot take the castle, but we will carry fire and sword round its walls. We will cut off all communication from within or from without. If attacked by large forces, we will retire upon the wood, returning to our posts without the walls as soon as the force is withdrawn. These heavily armed men can move but slowly, while we can run at full speed. There cannot be more than some 20 horsemen in the castle, and methinks with our arrows and pikes we can drive these back if they attempt to fall upon us. Canute at once sent off swift-footed messengers to carry out Cuthbert's orders, and on the following day the whole of the band were again assembled in the woods. Just as Cuthbert was setting them in motion, a distant blast of a horn was heard. It is, Cuthbert exclaimed, the note calling for a parley. Do you, Canute, go forward and see what is demanded. It is probably a messenger from Sir Rudolph. After half an hour's absence, Canute returned, bringing with him a pursuivant or herald. The latter advanced at once toward Cuthbert, who, now in his full knightly armor, was evidently the leader of the party. I bear to you, Sir Cuthbert, falsely calling yourself Earl of Evesham, a message from Sir Rudolph. He bids me tell you that the traitoress, Dame Editha, your mother, is in his hands, and that she has been found guilty of aiding and abetting you in your war against Prince John, the regent of this kingdom. For that offense she has been condemned to die. Here he was interrupted by a cry of rage which broke from the assembled foresters. Continuing unmoved, he said, Sir Rudolph, being unwilling to take the life of a woman, however justly forfeited by the law, commands me to say that if you will deliver yourself up to him by tomorrow at 12, the Dame Editha shall be allowed to go free, but that if by the time the dial points to noon you have not delivered yourself up, he will hang her over the battlements of the castle." Cuthbert was very pale, and he waved his hand to restrain the fury which animated the outlaws. "This man," he said to them, "is a herald, and as such is protected by all the laws of chivalry. Whatsoever his message, it is none of his. He is merely the mouthpiece of him who sent him." Then turning to the herald, he said, "Tell the false knight, your master, on my part, that he is a foul ruffian, perjured to all the vows of knighthood, that this act of visiting upon a woman the enmity he bears her son will bring upon him the execration of all men, and that the offer which he makes me is as foul and villainous as himself. Nevertheless, knowing his character and believing that he is capable of keeping his word, tell him that by tomorrow at noon I will be there, that the lady my mother is to leave the castle gates as I enter them, and that though by his foul device he may encompass my death, yet that the curse of every good man will light upon him, that he will be shunned as the dog he is, and that assuredly heaven will not suffer that deeds so foul should bring with them the prize he seeks to gain." The herald bowed, and escorted by 2 archers to the edge of the forest, returned to Evesham Castle. After his departure, an animated council took place. Canute and the outlaws, burning with indignation, were ready to attempt anything. They would, had Cuthbert given the word, have attacked the castle that very night, but Cuthbert pointed out the absolute impossibility of their carrying so strong a place by such an assault, unprovided with engines for battering down the gates. He said that surprise would be impossible, as the knight would be sure to take every precaution against it, and that in the event of such an attack being attempted, he would possibly carry his threat into execution and murder Dame Editha before their eyes. Canute was like a madman, so transported with fury was he, and the archers were also beside themselves. Cuthbert alone retained his calmness. Retiring apart from the others, he paced slowly backward and forward among the trees, deliberating upon the best course to be pursued. The archers gathered round the fire, and passed the night in long and angry talk, each man agreeing that in the event of their beloved leader being sacrificed by Sir Rudolph, they would one and all give their lives to avenge him by slaying the oppressor whensoever he ventured beyond the castle gates. After a time Cuthbert called Canute to him, and the 2 talked long and earnestly. Canute returned to his comrades with a face less despairing than that he had before worn, and sent off at once a messenger with all speed to a franklin near the forest to borrow a stout rope some 50 feet in length, and without telling his comrades what the plans of Sir Cuthbert were, bade them cheer up, for that desperate as the position was, all hope was not yet lost. "Sir Cuthbert," he said, "has been in grievous straits before now, and has gone through them. Sir Rudolph does not know the nature of the man with whom he has to deal, and we may trick him yet." At 11 o'clock the next day, from the walls of Evesham Castle, a body of archers, 150 strong, were seen advancing in solid array. "Think you, Sir Rudolph," one of his friends, Sir Hubert of Gloucester, said to him, "that these varlets think of attacking the castle?" "They might as well think of scaling heaven," Sir Rudolph said. "Evesham could resist a month's siege by a force well equipped for the purpose, and were it not that good men are wanted for the king's service, and that these villains shoot straight and hard, I would open the gates of the castle and launch our force against them. We are 2 to 1 as strong as they, and our knights and mounted men-at-arms could alone scatter that rabble." Conspicuous upon the battlements, a gallows had been erected. The archers stopped at a distance of a few hundred yards from the castle, and Sir Cuthbert advanced alone to the edge of the moat. Sir Rudolph of Eresby, false knight and perjured gentleman, he shouted in a loud voice, I, Sir Cuthbert of Evesham, do denounce you as forsworn and dishonored, and do challenge you to meet me here before the castle in sight of your men and mine, and decide our quarrel as heaven may judge with sword and battle axe. Sir Rudolph leaned over the battlements and said, It is too late, varlet. I condescended to challenge you before, and you refused. You cannot now claim what you then feared to accept. The sun on the dial approaches noon, and unless you surrender yourself before it reaches the mark, I will keep my word, and the traitress, your mother, shall swing from that beam. Making a sign to 2 men-at-arms, these brought forward Dame Editha, and so placed her on the battlements that she could be seen from below. Dame Editha was still a very fair woman, although nigh 40 years had rolled over her head. No sign of fear appeared on her face, and in a firm voice she cried to her son, Cuthbert, I beg, nay, I order you to retire. If this unknightly lord venture to carry out his foul threats against me, let him do so. England will ring with the dastardly deed, and he will never dare show his face again where Englishmen congregate. Let him do his worst. I am prepared to die. A murmur rose from the knights and men-at-arms, standing round Sir Rudolph. Several of his companions had from the first, wild and reckless as they were, protested against Sir Rudolph's course, and it was only upon his solemn assurance that he intended but to frighten Sir Cuthbert into surrender, and had no intention of carrying his threats against the lady into effect, that they had consented to take part in the transaction. Even now, at the fearless words of the Saxon lady, several of them hesitated, and Sir Hubert of Gloucester stepped forward to Sir Rudolph. Sir Knight, he said, you know that I am your true comrade, and the faithful servant of Prince John. Yet in faith would I not that my name should be mixed up in so foul a deed. I repent me that I have for a moment consented to it. But the shame shall not hang upon the escutcheon of Hubert of Gloucester, that he stood still when such foul means were tried. I pray you, by our long friendship, and for the sake of your honor as a knight, to desist from this endeavor. If this lady be guilty, as she well may be, of aiding her son in his assaults upon the soldiers of Prince John, then let her be tried, and doubtless the court will confiscate her estates. But let her son be told that her life is in no danger, and that he is free to go, being assured that harm will not come to her. And if I refuse to consent to allow my enemy, who is now almost within my hand, to escape, Sir Rudolph said, what then? Then, said the knight, I and my following will at once leave your walls, and will clear ourselves to the brave young knight yonder of all hand in this foul business. A murmur of agreement from several of those standing round showed that their sentiments were in accordance with those of Sir Hubert. I refuse, said Rudolph passionately. Go if you will. I am master of my actions and of this castle. Without a word, Sir Hubert and 2 others of the knights present turned, and briefly ordering their men-at-arms to follow them, descended the staircase to the courtyard below. Their horses were brought out, the men fell into rank, and the gates of the castle were thrown open. Stand to arms, Sir Cuthbert shouted to the archers. They are going to attempt a sortie, and hastily he retired to the main body of his men. End of chapter 22, read by Douglas Allen. Chapter 23 of The Boy Knight, A Tale of the Crusades. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Douglas Allen. The Boy Knight, A Tale of the Crusades by G. A. Henty. Chapter 23. The False and Perjured Knight. As the band of knights and their retainers issued from the gate, a trumpeter blew a parley, and the three knights advanced alone toward the group of archers. "Sir Cuthbert de Lance," Sir Hubert said, "in the name of myself and my two friends here, we ask your pardon for having so far taken part in this foul action. We did so believing only that Sir Rudolph intended the capture of your lady mother as a threat. Now that we see he was in earnest, we wash our hands of the business. And could we in any way atone for our conduct in having joined him, we would gladly do so consistently only with our allegiance to the Prince Regent." Cuthbert bowed courteously. "Thanks for your words, Sir Hubert. I had always heard yourself and the knights here spoken of as brave and gallant gentlemen, whose sole fault was that they chose to take part with a rebel prince rather than with the King of England. I rejoice that you have cleared your name of so foul a blot as this would have placed upon it, and I acknowledge that your conduct now is knightly and courteous. But I can no more parley. The sun is within a few minutes of 12, and I must surrender, to meet such fate as may befall me." So saying, with a bow he left them, and again advanced to the castle gate. "Sir Rudolph," he shouted, "the hour is at hand. I call upon you to deliver, outside the gate, the lady, my mother. Whether she wills it or not, I call upon you to place her beyond the gate, and I give you my knightly word that as she leaves it, I enter it." Dame Editha would then have attempted resistance, but she saw that it would be useless. With a pale face she descended the steps, accompanied by the men-at-arms. She knew that any entreaty to Sir Rudolph would be vain, and with the courage of her race she mentally vowed to devote the rest of her life to vengeance for her son. As the gate opened and she was thrust forth, for a moment she found herself in the arms of her son. "Courage, mother," he whispered. "All may yet be well." Canute was waiting a few paces behind, and offering his hand to Dame Editha, he led her to the group of archers, while Cuthbert alone crossed the drawbridge and entered the portal, the heavy portcullis falling after him. Canute, immediately ordering 4 of his men to escort Dame Editha to the wood with all speed, advanced with his men toward the walls. All had strung their bows and placed their arrows on the ground in front of them in readiness for instant use. Canute himself, with 2 others carrying the rope, advanced to the edge of the moat. None observed their doings, for all within the castle were intent upon the proceedings there. In the courtyard Sir Rudolph had taken his post, with the captain of the mercenaries beside him, and the men-at-arms drawn up in order. He smiled sardonically as Cuthbert entered. "So at last," he said, "this farce is drawing to an end. You are in my power, and for the means which I have taken to capture you, I will account to the prince. You are a traitor to him. You have attacked and slaughtered many of my friends. You are an outlaw defying the law, and for each of these offenses your head is forfeited." "I deny," Cuthbert said, standing before him, "your right to be my judge. By my peers only can I be tried. As a knight of England, and as rightful lord of this castle, I demand to be brought before a jury of my equals." "I care nothing for rights or for juries," said Sir Rudolph. "I have the royal order for your execution, and that order I shall put into effect, although all the knights and barons in England objected." Cuthbert looked round to observe the exact position in which he was standing. He knew, of course, every foot of the castle, and saw that but a short distance behind a single row of armed men was the staircase leading to the battlements. "False and perjured knight," he said, taking a step forward, "I may die, but I would rather 1,000 deaths than such a life as yours will be when this deed is known in England. But I am not yet dead. For myself I could pardon you, but for the outrage to my mother—" And with a sudden movement he struck Sir Rudolph in the face with all his strength with his mailed hand. With the blood gushing from his nostrils, the knight fell backward, and Sir Cuthbert, with a bound, before the assembly could recover from their astonishment at the deed, burst through the line of men-at-arms and sprang up the narrow staircase. A score of men-at-arms started in pursuit, but Sir Cuthbert gained the battlements first, and without a moment's hesitation sprang upon them and plunged forward, falling into the moat 50 feet below. Here he would have perished miserably, for in his heavy armor he was of course unable to swim a stroke, and his weight took him at once into the mud of the moat. At its margin, however, Canute stood awaiting him, with one end of the rope in his hand. In an instant he plunged in, and diving to the bottom, grasped Cuthbert by the body, and twisted the rope round him. The 2 archers on the bank at once hauled upon it, and in a minute Sir Cuthbert was dragged to the bank. By this time a crowd of men-at-arms appeared upon the battlements, but as they did so, the archers opened a storm of arrows upon them, and quickly compelled them to find shelter. Carried by Canute and the men with him, for he was insensible, Sir Cuthbert was quickly conveyed to the center of the outlaws, and these at once, in a compact body, began their retreat to the wood. Cuthbert quickly recovered consciousness, and was soon able to walk. As he did so, the gates of the castle were thrown open, and a crowd of men-at-arms, consisting of the retainers of the castle and the mercenaries of Prince John, sallied forth. So soon as Cuthbert was able to move, the archers started at a brisk run, several of them carrying Cuthbert's casque and sword, and others assisting him to hurry along. The rear ranks turned as they ran, and discharged flights of arrows at the enemy, who, more heavily armed and weighted, gained but slowly upon them. Had not Sir Rudolph been stunned by the blow dealt him by Cuthbert, he would himself have headed the pursuit, and in that case the foresters would have had to fight hard to make their retreat to their fastness. The officer in command of the mercenaries, however, had no great stomach for the matter. Men were hard to get, and Prince John would not have been pleased to hear that a number of the men whom he had brought with such expense from foreign parts had been killed in a petty fray. Therefore, after following for a short time, he called them off, and the archers fell back into the forest. Here they found Dame Editha, and for 3 days she abode among them, living in a small hut in the center of the forest. Then she left to take up her abode until the troubles were past with some kin who lived in the south of Gloucestershire. Although the Lady Abbess had assured Cuthbert that the retreat of Lady Margaret was not likely to be found out, he himself, knowing how great a stake Sir Rudolph had in the matter, was still far from being easy. It would not be difficult for the latter to learn, through his agents, that the Lady Superior of the little convent near Hereford was of kin to her of St. Anne's, and, close as a convent is, yet the gossiping of the servants who go to market was certain to let out an affair so important as the arrival of a young lady to reside under the charge of the superior. Cuthbert was not mistaken as to the acuteness of his enemy. The relationship between the 2 lady superiors was no secret, and after having searched all the farmhouses and granges near the forest, and being convinced that the Lady Abbess would have sent her charge rather to a religious house than to that of a franklin, Sir Rudolph sought which of those within the circuit of a few miles would be likely to be the one selected. It was not long before he was enabled to fix upon that near Hereford, and spies going to the spot soon found out from the country people that it was a matter of talk that a young lady of rank had been admitted by the superior. Sir Rudolph hesitated whether to go himself at the head of a strong body of men and openly to take her, or to employ some sort of device. It was not that he himself feared the anathema of the Church, but he knew Prince John to be weak and vacillating, at one time ready to defy the thunder of the Pope, the next cringing before the spiritual authority. He therefore determined to employ some of his men to burst into the convent and carry off the heiress, arranging that he himself, with some of his men-at-arms, should come upon them in the road and make a feigned rescue of her, so that, if the Lady Superior laid her complaint before the Pope's legate, he could deny that he had any hand in the matter, and could even take credit for having rescued her from the men who had profaned the convent. That his story would be believed mattered but little. It would be impossible to prove its falsity, and this was all that he cared for. This course was followed out. Late one evening, the Lady Superior was alarmed by a violent knocking at the door. In reply to questions asked through the grille, the answer was given: "We are men of the forest, and we are come to carry the Lady Margaret of Evesham off to a secure hiding place. The Lord of Evesham has discovered her whereabouts, and will be here shortly, and we would fain remove her before he arrives." "From whom have you warrant?" the Lady Superior said. "I surrender her to no one, save to the Lady Abbess of St. Anne's. But if you have a written warrant from Sir Cuthbert, the rightful Lord of Evesham, I will lay the matter before the Lady Margaret, and will act as it may seem fit to her." "We have no time for parleying," a rough voice said. "Throw open the gate at once, or we will break it down." "Ye be no outlaws," the Lady Superior said, "for the outlaws are men who fear God and respect the Church. Were ye what ye say, ye would be provided with the warrants that I mention. I warn you, therefore, that if you use force, you will be excommunicated and placed under the ban of the Church." The only answer was a thundering assault upon the gate, which soon yielded to the blows. The sisters and novices ran shrieking through the corridors at this rude uproar. The Lady Superior, however, stood calmly awaiting the giving way of the gate. "Where is the Lady Margaret?" the leader of the party, who were dressed in rough garb, and had the seeming of a band of outlaws, demanded. "I will say nothing," she said, "nor do I own that she is here." "We will soon take means to find out," the man exclaimed. "Unless in 5 minutes she is delivered to us, we will burn your place to the ground." The Lady Abbess was insensible to the threat, but the men rushing in seized some sisters, who, terrified out of their wits by this irruption, at once gave the information demanded, and the men made their way to the cell where the Lady Margaret slept. The girl had at once risen when the tumult commenced, doubting not in her mind that this was another attempt upon the part of her enemy to carry her off. When, therefore, she heard heavy footsteps approaching along the gallery, having already hastily attired herself, she opened the door and presented herself. "If you seek the Lady Margaret of Evesham," she said calmly, "I am she. Do not harm any of the sisters here. I am in your power, and will go with you at once. But I beseech you, add not to your other sins that of violence against holy women." The men, abashed by the calm dignity of this young girl, abstained from laying hands upon her, but merely motioned to her to accompany them. Upon their way they met the man who appeared to be their leader, and he, well pleased that the affair was over, led the way to the courtyard. "Farewell, my child," the abbess exclaimed. "God will deliver you from the power of these wicked men. Trust in him and keep up your courage. Wickedness will not be permitted to triumph upon the earth. And be assured that the matter shall be brought to the ears of the Pope's legate and of Prince John himself." She could say no more, for the men, closing round the weeping girl, hurried her out from the convent. A litter awaited them without, and in this the young lady was placed, and borne upon the shoulders of 4 stout men. She started at a fast pace, surrounded closely by the rest of the band. It was a dark night, and the girl could not see the direction in which she was being taken, but she judged from the turn taken upon leaving the convent that it was toward Evesham. They had proceeded some miles when a trampling of horses was heard, and a body of armed men rode up. For a moment Lady Margaret's heart gave a leap, for she thought that she had been rescued by her friends. There was a loud and angry altercation, a clashing of swords, and a sound of shouting and cries outside the litter. Then it was placed roughly on the ground, and she heard the sound of the footsteps of her first captors hurrying away. Then the horsemen closed round the litter, and the leader dismounted. "I am happy indeed, Lady Margaret," he said, approaching the litter, "to have been able to save you from the power of these villains. Fortunately, word came to me that the outlaws in the forest were about to carry you off, and that they would not hesitate even to desecrate the walls of the convent. Assembling my men-at-arms, I at once rode to your rescue, and am doubly happy to have saved you, first as a gentleman, secondly as being the man to whom our gracious prince has assigned you as a wife. I am Sir Rudolph, Earl of Evesham." As from the first the girl had been convinced that she had fallen into the power of her lawless suitor, this came upon her as no surprise. "Whether your story is true, Sir Rudolph," she said, "or not, God knows, and I, a poor weak girl, will not pretend to venture to say. It is between you and your conscience. If, as you say, you have saved me from the power of the outlaws, I demand that as a knight and a gentleman you return with me at once to the convent from which I was taken by force." "I cannot do that," Sir Rudolph said. "Fortune has placed you in my hands, and has enabled me to carry out the commands of the prince. Therefore, though I would fain yield to your wishes and so earn your good will, which above all things I wish to obtain, yet my duty toward the prince commands me to utilize the advantage which fate has thrown in my hands." "You must do as you will, Sir Rudolph," the girl said with dignity. "I believe not your tale. You sought before in person to carry me off, but failed, and you have now employed other means to do so. The tale of your conduct to Dame Editha has reached my ears, and I hold you a forsworn knight and a dishonored man, and as such I would rather die than become your wife, although as yet I am but a child, and have no need to talk of weddings for years to come." "We need not parley here," the knight said coldly. "We shall have plenty of time when at my castle." The litter was now lifted, placed between 2 horses, and proceeded rapidly on its journey. Although the hope was but faint, yet until the gates of the castle closed upon them, the Lady Margaret still hoped that rescue might reach her. But the secret had been too well kept, and it was not until the following day that the man who had been placed in a cottage near the convent arrived in all haste in the forest, to say that it was only in the morning that he had learned that the convent had been broken open by men disguised as archers, and the Lady Margaret carried off. 4 days elapsed before Sir Rudolph presented himself before the girl he had captured. So fearfully was his face bruised and disfigured by the blow from the mailed hand of Cuthbert 3 weeks before, that he did not wish to appear before her under such unfavorable circumstances, and the captive passed the day gazing from her casement in one of the rooms in the upper part of the keep, toward the forest whence she hoped rescue would come. Within the forest hot discussions were going on as to the best course to pursue. An open attack was out of the question, especially as upon the day following the arrival there of Lady Margaret 300 more mercenaries had marched in from Worcester, so that the garrison was now raised to 500 men. "Is there no way," Canute exclaimed furiously, "by which we might creep into this den, since we cannot burst into it openly?" "There is a way from the castle," Cuthbert said, "for my dear lord told me of it one day when we were riding together in the Holy Land. He said then that it might be that he should never return, and that it were well that I should know of the existence of this passage, which few, besides the Earl himself, knew of. It is approached by a very heavy slab of stone in the great hall. This is bolted down, and as it stands under the great table passes unnoticed, and appears part of the ordinary floor. He told me the method in which, by touching a spring, the bolts were withdrawn and the stone could be raised. Thence a passage 1/4 of a mile long leads to the little chapel standing in the hollow, and which, being hidden among the trees, would be unobserved by any party besieging the castle. This of course was contrived in order that the garrison, or any messenger thereof, might make an exit in case of siege." "But if we could escape," Canute asked, "why not enter by this way?" "The stone is of immense weight and strength," Cuthbert replied, "and could not be loosed from below save with great labor and noise. There are, moreover, several massive doors in the passage, all of which are secured by heavy bolts within. It is therefore out of the question that we could enter the castle by that way. But were we once in, we could easily carry off the lady through this passage." The large force which Sir Rudolph had collected was not intended merely for the defense of the castle, for the knight considered that with his own garrison he could hold it against a force tenfold that which his rival could collect. But he was determined, if possible, to crush out the outlaws of the forest, for he felt that so long as this formidable body remained under an enterprising leader like Sir Cuthbert, he would never be safe for a moment, and would be a prisoner in his own castle. Cuthbert had foreseen that the attack was likely to be made, and had strengthened his band to the utmost. He felt, however, that against so large a force of regularly armed men, although he might oppose a stout resistance and kill many, yet that in the end he must be conquered. Canute, however, suggested to him a happy idea, which he eagerly grasped. "It would be a rare sport," Canute said, "when this armed force comes out to attack us, if we could turn the tables by slipping in and taking their castle." "The very thing!" Cuthbert exclaimed. "It is likely that he will use the greater portion of his forces, and that he will not keep above 50 or 60 men at the outside in the castle. When they sally out, we will at first oppose a stout resistance to them in the wood, gradually falling back. Then at a given signal, all save 20 men shall retire hastily, and sweeping round, make for the castle. Their absence will not be noticed, for in this thick wood it is difficult to tell whether 20 men or 200 are opposing you among the bushes. And the 20 who remain must shoot thick and fast to make believe that their numbers are great, retiring sometimes and leading the enemy on into the heart of the wood. But supposing, Sir Cuthbert, that they should have closed the gates and lifted the drawbridge, we could not gain entrance by storming, even if only 20 men held the walls, until long after the main body would have returned." Cuthbert thought for some time, and then said, "Canute, you shall undertake this enterprise. You shall fill a cart high with faggots, and in it shall conceal a dozen of your best men. You, dressed as a serf, shall drive the oxen, and when you reach the castle, shall say, in answer to the hail of the sentry, that you are bringing in the tribute of wood of your master, the Franklin of Hopeburn. They will then lower the drawbridge and open the gates, and when you have crossed the bridge and are under the portcullis, spring out suddenly, cut loose the oxen, so that they will not draw the cart further in, cut the chains of the drawbridge, so that it cannot be drawn off, and hold the gate for a minute or two until we arrive." "The plan is capital," Canute exclaimed. "We will do the proud Norman yet. How he will storm when he finds us masters of his castle! What then will you do, Sir Cuthbert?" "We can hold the castle for weeks," Cuthbert said, "and every day is in our favor. If we find ourselves forced to yield to superior numbers, we can at last retire through the passage I have spoken of, and must then scatter, and each shift for himself, until these bad days be past." End of chapter 23, read by Douglas Allen.
Chapter 24 of The Boy Knight, A Tale of the Crusades. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Jeff Reynolds. The Boy Knight, A Tale of the Crusades by G.A. Henty. Chapter 24, The Siege of Evesham Castle. Upon the day before starting out to head the expedition against the outlaws, Sir Rudolph sent word to the Lady Margaret that she must prepare to become his wife at the end of the week. He had provided 2 tiring maids for her by ordering 2 of the Franklins to send in their daughters for that purpose, and these mingled their tears with Margaret's at the situation in which they were placed. She replied firmly to the messenger of the knight that no power on earth could oblige her to marry him. He might drive her to the altar, but though he killed her there, her lips should refuse to say the words which would unite them. The following morning, early, the castle rang with the din of preparation. The great portion of the mercenaries were camped in tents outside the walls, for, spacious as it was, Evesham could hardly contain 400 men in addition to its usual garrison. The men-at-arms were provided with heavy axes to cut their way through the bushes. Some carried bundles of straw to fire the wood should it be found practicable to do so, and as it was now summer and the wind was blowing high, Sir Rudolph hoped that the dry grass and bushes would catch, and would do more even than his men-at-arms at clearing the forest of those whom he designated the villains infesting it. They had, too, with them several fierce dogs trained to hunting the deer, and these, the knight hoped, would do good service in tracking the outlaws. He and the knights and the men-at-arms with him were all dismounted, for he felt that horses would in the forest be an encumbrance, and he was determined himself to lead the way to the men-at-arms. When they reached the forest, they were saluted by a shower of arrows, but as all were clad in mail, these at a distance effected but little harm. As they came closer, however, the cloth-yard arrows began to pierce the coarse and ill-made armor of the foot soldiers, although the finer armor of the knights kept out the shafts which struck against it. Sir Rudolph and his knights leading the way, they entered the forest and gradually pressed their invisible foe backward through the trees. The dogs did good service, going on ahead and attacking the archers, but one by one they were soon shot, and the assailants left to their own devices. Several attempts were made to fire the wood, but these failed, the fire burning but a short time and then dying out of itself. In addition to the fighting men, Sir Rudolph had impressed into the service all the serfs of his domain, and these, armed with axes, were directed to cut down the trees as the force proceeded, Sir Rudolph declaring that he would not cease until he had leveled the whole forest, though it might take him months to do so. The assailants gained ground steadily, the resistance being less severe than Sir Rudolph had anticipated. Several small huts and clearings in the forest which had been used by the outlaws, and round which small crops had been planted, were destroyed, and all seemed to promise well for the success of the enterprise. It was about 2 hours after they had left the castle when a heavy cart filled with faggots was seen approaching its gates. The garrison, who had not the least fear of any attack, paid no attention to it until it reached the edge of the moat. Then the warder, seeing that it contained faggots, lowered the drawbridge without question, raised the portcullis, and opened the gates. "From whom do you bring this wood?" he asked as the man driving the oxen began to cross the bridge. "From the Franklin of Hopeburn." "It is well," said the warder, "for he is in arrear now, and should have sent in the firewood 2 months since. Take it to the woodhouse at the other end of the court." The heavy wagon crossed the drawbridge, but as it was entering the gate it came suddenly to a stop. With a blow of his ox-goad, Canute leveled the warder to the ground, and cutting the cords of the bullocks, drove them into the yard ahead. As he did so, the pile of faggots fell asunder, and 12 men armed with bow and pike leaped out. The men-at-arms standing near, lounging in the courtyard, gave a shout of alarm, and the garrison, surprised at this sudden cry, ran to their arms. At first they were completely panic-stricken, but seeing after a time how small was the number of their assailants, they took heart and advanced against them. The passage was narrow, and the 12 men formed a wall across it. 6 of them with their pikes advanced, the other 6 with bent bows standing behind them and delivering their arrows between their heads. The garrison fought stoutly, and although losing many, were pressing the little band backward. In vain the assistant warder tried to lower the portcullis or to close the gates. The former fell on top of the wagon and was there retained. The gates also were barred by the obstacle. The chains of the drawbridge had at once been cut. Cnut encouraged his followers by his shouts, and armed with a heavy axe did good service upon the assailants. But 4 of his party had fallen, and the rest were giving way, when a shout was heard, and over the drawbridge poured Cuthbert and 150 of the outlaws of the forest. Struck with terror at this attack, the garrison drew back, and the foresters poured into the yard. For a few minutes there was a fierce fight, but the defenders of the castle, disheartened and taken by surprise, were either cut down or, throwing down their arms, cried for quarter. 10 minutes after the wagon had crossed the drawbridge, the castle was safely in possession of Sir Cuthbert. The bridge was raised, the wagon removed, the portcullis lowered, and to the external eye all remained as before. Cuthbert at once made his way to the chamber where the Lady Margaret was confined, and her joy at her deliverance was great indeed. So unlimited was her faith in Sir Cuthbert that she had never lost confidence, and although it did not seem possible that in the face of such disparity of numbers he could rescue her from the power of Sir Rudolph, yet she had not given up hope. The joy of the farmer's daughters who had been carried off to act as her attendants was little inferior to her own, for once in the power of this reckless baron, the girls had small hopes of ever being allowed to return again to their parents. The flag of Sir Rudolph was thrown down from the keep, and that of the late earl hoisted in its stead. For Cuthbert himself, although he had assumed the cognizance which King Richard had granted him, had not yet any flag or pennon emblazoned with it. No words can portray the stupefaction and rage of Sir Rudolph when a man who had managed to slip unobserved from the castle at the time of its capture bore the news to him in the forest. All opposition there had ceased, and the whole of the troops were engaged in aiding the peasants in cutting wide roads through the trees across the forest, so as to make it penetrable by horsemen in every direction. It was supposed that the outlaws had gradually stolen away through the thickets and taken to the open country, intending to scatter to their homes, or other distant hiding places, and the news that they had by a ruse captured the castle came as a thunderclap. Sir Rudolph's first impulse was to call his men together and to march toward the castle. The drawbridge was up and the walls bristled with armed men. It was useless to attempt to parley. Still more useless to think of attacking the stronghold without the proper machines and appliances. Foaming with rage, Sir Rudolph took possession of a cottage near, camped his men around, and prepared for a siege. There were among the mercenaries many men accustomed to the use of engines of war. Many, too, had aided in making them, and these were at once set to work to construct the various machines in use at that time. Before the invention of gunpowder, castles such as those of the English barons were able to defy any attack by an armed force for a long period. Their walls were so thick that even the ballistas, casting huge stones, were unable to breach them except after a very long time. The moats which surrounded them were wide and deep, and any attempt at storming by ladders was therefore extremely difficult. And these buildings were consequently more often captured by famine than by other means. Of provisions, as Sir Rudolph knew, there was a considerable supply at present in the castle, for he had collected a large number of bullocks in order to feed the strong body who had been added to the garrison. The granaries, too, were well stored, and with a groan Sir Rudolph thought of the rich stores of French wines which he had collected in his cellars. After much deliberation with the knights with him and the captain of the mercenaries, it was agreed in the first instance to attempt to attack the place by filling up a portion of the moat and ascending by scaling ladders. Huge screens of wood were made, and these were placed on wagons. The wagons themselves were filled with bags of earth, and a large number of men getting beneath them shoved the ponderous machines forward to the edge of the moat. The bags of stones and earth were then thrown in, and the wagons pushed backward to obtain a fresh supply. The operation was, of course, an exceedingly slow one, a whole day being occupied with each trip of the wagons. They were not unmolested in their advance, for, from the walls, mangonels and other machines hurled great stones down upon the wooden screens, succeeding sometimes, in spite of their thickness, in crashing through them, killing many of the men beneath. The experiment was also tried of throwing balls of Greek fire down upon the wood, but as this was green and freshly felled, it would not take fire. But the flames dripping through, with much boiling pitch and other materials, did grievously burn and scald the soldiers working below it. Upon both sides every device was tried. The crossbowmen among the mercenaries kept up a fire upon the walls to hinder the defenders from interfering with the operations, while the archers above shot steadily and killed many of those who ventured within range of their bows. After 10 days' labor, a portion of the moat, some 20 yards in length, was filled with bags of earth, and all was ready for the assault. The besiegers had prepared great numbers of strong ladders, and these were brought up under shelter of the screens. Then, all being ready, the trumpets sounded for the assault, and the troops moved forward in a close body, covering themselves with their shields so that no man's head or body was visible, each protecting the one before him with the shield held over him. Thus the body presented the appearance of a great scale-covered animal. In many respects, indeed, the warfare of these days was changed in no way from that of the time of the Romans. In the 1200 years which had elapsed between the siege of Jerusalem and the days of the Crusades, there had been but little change in arms or armor, and the operations which Titus undertook for the reduction of the Jewish stronghold differed but little from those which a Norman baron employed in besieging his neighbor's castle. Within Evesham Castle all was contentment and merriment during these days. The garrison had no fear whatever, being unable to repel the assault when it should be delivered. Huge stones had been collected in numbers on the walls. Cauldrons of pitch, beneath which fires kept simmering, stood there in readiness. Long poles with hooks with which to seize the ladders and cut them down were laid there, and all that precaution and science could do was prepared. Cuthbert passed much of the day, when not required upon the walls, chatting with the Lady Margaret, who, attended by her maidens, sat working in her bower. She had learned to read from the good nuns of the convent, an accomplishment which was by no means general, even among the daughters of nobles, but books were rare, and Evesham boasted but few manuscripts. Here Margaret learned in full all the details of Cuthbert's adventures since leaving England, and the fondness with which as a child she had regarded the lad grew gradually into the affection of a woman. The courage of the garrison was high, for although they believed that sooner or later the castle might be carried by the besiegers, they had already been told by Canute that there was a means of egress unknown to the besiegers, and that when the time came they would be able to escape unharmed. This, while it in no way detracted from their determination to defend the castle to the last, yet rendered their task a far lighter and more agreeable one than it would have been had they seen the gallows standing before them at the end of the siege. As the testudo, as it was called in those days, advanced toward the castle, the machines upon the walls, catapults, mangonels, and arbalists, poured forth showers of stones and darts upon it, breaking up the array of shields and killing many. And as these openings were made, the archers, seizing their time, poured in volleys of arrows. The mercenaries, however, accustomed to war, advanced steadily, and made good their footing beneath the castle wall, and proceeded to rear their ladders. Here, although free from the action of the machines, they were exposed to the hand missiles, which were scarcely less destructive. In good order and with firmness, however, they reared the ladders and mounted to the assault, covering themselves as well as they could with their shields. In vain, however, did they mount. The defenders poured down showers of boiling pitch and oil, which penetrated the crevices of their armor and caused intolerable torment. Great stones were toppled over from the battlements upon them, and sometimes the ladders, seized by the poles with the hooks, were cast backwards with all upon them on the throng below. For half an hour, encouraged by the shouts of Sir Rudolph and their leaders, the soldiers strove gallantly, but were at last compelled to draw off, having lost nigh 100 men, without one gaining a footing upon the walls. That evening another council of war was held without. Already some large machines for which Sir Rudolph had sent had arrived. In anticipation of the possibility of failure, 2 castles upon wheels had been prepared, and between these a huge beam with an iron head was hung. This was upon the following day pushed forward on the newly formed ground across the moat. Upon the upper part of each tower were armed men who worked machines casting sheaves of arrows and other missiles. Below were those who worked the ram. To each side of the beam were attached numerous cords, and with these it was swung backward and forward, giving heavy blows each stroke upon the wall. The machines for casting stones, which had arrived, were also brought in play, and day and night these thundered against the walls, while the ram repeated its ceaseless blows upon the same spot until the stone crumbled before it. Very valiantly did the garrison oppose themselves to these efforts, but each day showed the progress made by the besiegers. Their forces had been increased, Prince John having ordered his captain at Gloucester to send another 100 men to the assistance of Sir Rudolph. Other towers had now been prepared. These were larger than the first and overtopped the castle walls. From the upper story were drawbridges, so formed as to drop from the structures upon the walls, and thus enable the besiegers to rush upon them. The process was facilitated by the fact that the battlements had been shot away by the great stones, and there was a clear space on which the drawbridges could fall. The attack was made with great vigor, but for a long time the besieged maintained their post and drove back the assailants as they poured out across the drawbridges onto the wall. At last Cuthbert saw that the forces opposed to him were too numerous to be resisted, and gave orders to his men to fall back upon the inner keep. Making one rush and clearing the wall of those who had gained a footing, the garrison fell back hastily, and were safely within the massive keep before the enemy had mustered in sufficient numbers upon the wall to interfere with them. The drawbridge was now lowered, and the whole of the assailants gained footing within the castle. They were still far from having achieved a victory. The walls of the keep were massive and strong, and its top far higher than the walls, so that from above a storm of arrows poured down upon all who ventured to show themselves. The keep had no windows low enough down for access to be gained, and those on the floors above were so narrow and protected by bars that it seemed by scaling the walls alone could an entry be effected. This was far too desperate an enterprise to be attempted, for the keep rose 80 feet above the courtyard. It was upon the door, solid and studded with iron, that the attempt had to be made. Several efforts were made by Sir Rudolph, who fought with a bravery worthy of a better cause, to assault and batter down the door. Protected by wooden shields from the rain of missiles from above, he and his knights hacked at the door with their battle axes, but in vain. It had been strengthened by beams behind and by stones piled up against it. Then fire was tried. Faggots were collected in the forest and brought, and a huge pile having been heaped against the door was lighted. "We could doubtless prolong the siege for some days, Lady Margaret," said Cuthbert, "but the castle is ours, and we wish not, when the time comes that we shall again be masters of it, that it should be a mere heap of ruins. Methinks we have done enough. With but small losses on our side, we have killed great numbers of the enemy, and have held them at bay for a month. Therefore, I think that tonight it will be well for us to leave the place." Lady Margaret was rejoiced at the news that the time for escape had come, for the perpetual clash of war, the rattling of arrows, the ponderous thud of heavy stones, caused a din very alarming to a young girl, and although the room in which she sat, looking into the inner court of the castle, was not exposed to missiles, she trembled at the thought that brave men were being killed, and that at any moment a shot might strike Cuthbert, and so leave her without a friend or protector. Content with having destroyed the door, the assailants made no further effort that evening, but prepared in the morning to attack it, pulled down the stones filled behind it, and forced their way into the keep. There was, with the exception of the main entrance, but one means of exit, a small postern door behind the castle, and throughout the siege a strong body of troops had been posted there to prevent the garrison from making a sortie. Feeling secure, therefore, that upon the following day his enemies would fall into his power, Sir Rudolph retired to rest. An hour before midnight the garrison assembled in the hall. The table was removed, and Cuthbert, having pressed the spring, which was at a distance from the stone and could not be discovered without a knowledge of its existence, the stone turned aside by means of a counterpoise, and a flight of steps was seen. Torches had been prepared. Canute and a chosen band went first. Cuthbert followed, with Lady Margaret and her attendants, and the rest of the archers brought up the rear, a trusty man being left in charge at last with orders to swing back the stone into its place, having first hauled the table over the spot, so that their means of escape should be unknown. The passage was long and dreary. The walls were damp with wet, and the massive doors so swollen by moisture that it was with the greatest difficulty that they could be opened. At last, however, they emerged into the little friary in the wood. It was deserted, the priest who usually dwelt there having fled when the siege began. The stone which there, as in the castle, concealed the exit, was carefully closed, and the party then emerged into the open air. Here Cuthbert bade adieu to his comrades. Cnut had very anxiously begged to be allowed to accompany him and share his fortunes, and Cuthbert had promised him that if at any time he should again take up arms in England, he would summon him to his side. But that at present, as he knew not whither his steps would be turned, it would be better that he should be unattended. The archers had all agreed to scatter far and wide through the country, many of them proceeding to Nottingham and joining the bands in the forest of Sherwood. Cuthbert himself had determined to make his way to the castle of his friend Sir Baldwin, and to leave the Lady Margaret in his charge. Cnut hurried on at full speed to the house of a franklin, some 3 miles distant. Here horses were obtained and saddled, and dresses prepared, and when Cuthbert with Lady Margaret arrived there, no time was lost. Dressed as a yeoman, with the Lady Margaret as his sister, he mounted a horse with her behind him on a pillion. The other damsels also mounted, as it would not have been safe for them to remain near Evesham. They therefore purposed taking refuge in a convent near Gloucester for the present. Bidding a hearty adieu to Cnut, and with thanks to the franklin who had aided them, they set forward on their journey. By morning they had reached the convent, and here the 2 girls were left, and Cuthbert continued his journey. He left his charge at a convent a day's ride distant from the castle of Sir Baldwin, as he wished to consult the knight first as to the best way of her entering the castle without exciting talk or suspicion. Sir Baldwin received him with joy. He had heard something of his doings, and the news of his siege of Evesham had been noised abroad. He told him that he was in communication with many other barons, and that ere long they hoped to rise against the tyranny of Prince John, but that at present they were powerless, as many, hoping that King Richard would return ere long, shrank from involving the country in a civil war. When Cuthbert told him that the daughter of his old friend was at a convent but a day's ride distant, and that he sought protection for her, Sir Baldwin instantly offered her hospitality. "I will," he said, "send my good wife to fetch her. Some here know your presence, and it would be better, therefore, if she did not arrive for some days, as her coming will then seem to be unconnected with yourself. My wife and I will, a week hence, give out that we are going to fetch a cousin of my wife's to stay here with her, and when we return no suspicion will be excited that she is other than she seems. Should it be otherwise, I need not say that Sir Baldwin of Bethune will defend his castle against any of the minions of Prince John, but I have no fear that her presence here will be discovered. What think you of doing in the meantime?" "I am thinking," Cuthbert said, "of going east. No news has been obtained of our lord the king, save that he is a prisoner in the hands of the emperor, but where confined or how we know not. It is my intent to travel to the Tyrol, and to trace his steps from the time that he was captured. Then, when I attain knowledge of the place where he is kept, I will return and consult upon the best steps to be taken. My presence in England is now useless. Did the barons raise the standard of King Richard against the prince, I should at once return and join them. But without land or vassals, I can do nothing here, and shall be indeed like a hunted hare, for I know that the false earl will move heaven and earth to capture me." Sir Baldwin approved of the resolution, but recommended Cuthbert to take every precaution not to fall himself into the hands of the emperor. "For," he said, "if we cannot discover the prison of King Richard, I fear that it would be hopeless indeed to ever attempt to find that in which a simple knight is confined." End of chapter 24.
Chapter 25 of The Boy Knight, A Tale of the Crusades. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Douglas Allen. The Boy Knight, A Tale of the Crusades by G.A. Henty. Chapter 25, In Search of the King. The following day, with many thanks, Cuthbert started from the castle, and in the first place visited the convent, and told Lady Margaret that she would be fetched in a few days by Sir Baldwin and his wife. He took a tender adieu of her, not without many forebodings and tears upon her part, but promising blithely that he would return and lead her back in triumph to her castle, he bade adieu and rode for London. He had attired himself as a merchant, and took up his abode at a hostelry near Cheapside. Here he remained quietly for some days, and, mixing among the people, learned that in London as elsewhere the rapacity of Prince John had rendered him hateful to the people, and that they would gladly embrace any opportunity of freeing themselves from his yoke. He was preparing to leave for France when the news came to him that Prince John had summoned all the barons faithful to him to meet him near London, and he recalled all his mercenaries from different parts of the country, and was gathering a large army. Also, that the barons faithful to King Richard, alarmed by the prospect, had raised the royal standard, and that true men were hurrying to their support. This entirely destroyed the plans that he had formed. Taking horse again, and avoiding the main road by which he might meet the hostile barons on their way to London, he journeyed down to Nottingham. Thence riding boldly into the forest, he sought the outlaws, and was not long ere he found them. At his request, he was at once taken before their leader, a man of great renown both for courage and bowmanship, one Robin Hood. This bold outlaw had long held at defiance the sheriff of Nottingham, and had routed him and all bodies of troops who had been sent against him. With him Cuthbert found many of his own men, and upon hearing that the royal standard had been raised, Robin Hood at once agreed to march with all his men to join the royal force. Messengers were dispatched to summon the rest of the forest band from their hiding places, and a week later Cuthbert, accompanied by Robin Hood and 300 archers, set out for the rendezvous. When they arrived there, they found that Sir Baldwin had already joined with his retainers, and was by him most warmly received, and introduced to the other barons in the camp, by whom Cuthbert was welcomed as a brother. The news that Prince John's army was approaching was brought in a fortnight after Cuthbert had joined the camp, and the army in good order moved out to meet the enemy. The forces were about equal. The battle began by a discharge of arrows, but Robin Hood and his men shot so true and fast that they greatly discomfited the enemy, and King John's mercenaries, having but little stomach for the fight, and knowing how unpopular they were in England, and that if defeated small mercy was likely to be shown to them, refused to advance against the ranks of the loyal barons, and falling back, declined to join in the fray. Seeing their numbers so weakened by this defection, the barons on the prince's side hesitated, and surrounding the prince, advised him to make terms with the barons while there was yet time. Prince John saw that the present was not a favorable time for him, and concealing his fury under a mask of courtesy, he at once acceded to the advice of his followers and dispatched a messenger to the barons, with an inquiry as to what they wanted of him. A council was held, and it was determined to demand the dismissal of the mercenaries and the dispatch back to their own country. Also that John would govern only as his brother's representative, that the laws of the country should be respected, that no taxes should be raised without the assent of the barons, that all men who had taken up arms against his authority should be held free, and that the barons on Prince John's side should return peaceably home and disband their forces. Seeing under these circumstances that there was no way before him but to yield to these demands, Prince John accepted the terms. The mercenaries were ordered to march directly to London, and orders were given that ships should be at once prepared to take them across to Normandy, and the barons marched for their homes. Satisfied, now that the mercenaries were gone, that they could henceforth hold their ground against Prince John, the royal barons also broke up their forces. Robin Hood, with his foresters, returned to Sherwood, and Cuthbert, bidding adieu to Sir Baldwin, rode back to London, determined to carry out the plan which he had formed. He was the more strengthened in this resolution, inasmuch as in the royal camp he had met a friend from whom he parted last in the Holy Land. This was Blondel, the minstrel of King Richard, whose songs and joyous music had often lightened the evening after days of fighting and toil in Palestine. To him Cuthbert confided his intention, and the minstrel instantly offered to accompany him. I shall, he said, be of assistance to you. Minstrels are like heralds. They are of no nationality, and can pass free, where a man-at-arms would be closely watched and hindered. Moreover, it may be that I might aid you greatly in discovering the prison of the king. So great is the secrecy with which this has been surrounded, that I question if any inquiries you could make would enable you to trace him. My voice, however, can penetrate into places where we cannot enter. I will take with me my lute, and as we journey, I will sing outside the walls of each prison we come to one of the songs which I sang in Palestine. King Richard is himself a singer, and knows my songs as well as myself. If I sing a verse of some song which I wrote there, and which, therefore, would be known only to him, if he hears it, he may follow with the next verse, and so enable us to know of his hiding-place. Cuthbert at once saw the advantages which such companionship would bring him, and joyfully accepted the minstrel's offer, agreeing himself to go as serving-man to Blondel. The latter accompanied him to London. Here their preparations were soon made, and taking ship in a merchantman bound for the Netherlands, they started without delay upon their adventure. The minstrels and troubadours were at that time a privileged race in Europe, belonging generally to the south of France, although produced in all lands. They traveled over Europe singing the lays which they themselves had composed, and were treated with all honor at the castles where they chose to alight. It would have been considered as foul a deed to use discourtesy to a minstrel as to insult a herald. Their persons were indeed regarded as sacred, and the knights and barons strove to gain their goodwill by hospitality and presents. As a large proportion of their ballads related to deeds of war, and while they would write lays in honor of those who courteously entertained them, they did not hesitate to heap obloquy upon those who received them discourteously, holding them up to the gibes and scoffs of their fellows. In no way, therefore, would success be so likely to attend the mission of those who set out to discover the hiding-place of King Richard as under the guise of a minstrel and his attendant. No questions would be asked them. They could halt where they would, in castle or town, secure of hospitality and welcome. Blondel was himself a native of the south of France, singing his songs in the soft language of Languedoc. Cuthbert's Norman French would pass muster anywhere as being that of a native of France, and although, when dressed as a servitor, attention might be attracted by his bearing, his youth might render it probable that he was of noble family, but that he had entered the service of the minstrel in order to qualify himself some day for following that career. He carried a long staff, a short sword, and at his back the lute or small harp played upon by the troubadour. Blondel's attire was rich, and suitable to a person of high rank. They crossed to the Scheldt, and thence travelled by the right bank of the Rhine as far as Mannheim, sometimes journeying by boat, sometimes on foot. They were also hospitably entertained, and were considered to more than repay their hosts by the songs which Blondel sang. At Mannheim they purchased 2 horses, and then struck east for Vienna. The journey was not without danger, for a large portion of this part of Europe was under no settled government, each petty baron living in his own castle, and holding but slight allegiance to any feudal lord, making war upon his neighbor on his own account, levying blackmail from travelers, and perpetually at variance with the burghers of the towns. The hills were covered with immense forests, which stretched for many leagues in all directions, and these were infested by wolves, bears, and robbers. The latter, however, although men without pity or religion, yet held the troubadours in high esteem, and the travelers without fear entered the gloomy shades of the forest. They had not gone far when their way was barred by a number of armed men. "I am a minstrel," Blondel said, "and as such doubt not that your courtesy will be extended to me." "Of a surety," the leader said, "the gay science is as much loved and respected in the Greenwood as in the castle, and moreover, the purses of those who follow it are too light to offer any temptation to us. We would pray you, however, to accompany us to our leader, who will mightily rejoice to see you, for he loves music, and will gladly be your host so long as you will stay with him." Blondel, without objection, turned his horse's head and accompanied the men, followed by Cuthbert. After half an hour's traveling, they came to a building which had formerly been a shrine, but which was now converted to the robbers' headquarters. The robber chief, on hearing from his followers the news that a minstrel had arrived, came forward to meet him and courteously bade him welcome. "I am Sir Adalbert of Rotherheim," he said, "although you see me in so poor a plight. My castle and lands have been taken by my neighbor, with whom for generations my family have been at feud. I was in the Holy Land with the Emperor, and on my return found that the Baron had taken the opportunity of my absence, storming my castle and seizing my lands. In vain I petitioned the Emperor to dispossess this traitorous Baron of my lands, which by all the laws of Christendom should have been respected during my absence. The Emperor did indeed send a letter to the Baron to deliver them up to me, but his power here is but nominal, and the Baron contemptuously threw the royal proclamation into the fire, and told the messenger that what he had taken by the sword he would hold by the sword. And the Emperor, having weightier matters on hand than to set troops in motion to redress the grievances of a simple knight, gave the matter no further thought. I have therefore been driven to the forest, where I live as best I may with my followers, most of whom were retainers upon my estate, and some my comrades in the Holy Land. I make war upon the rich and powerful, and beyond that do harm to no man. But, methinks," he continued, "I know your face, gentle sir." "It may well be so, Sir Adalbert," the minstrel said, "for I too was in the Holy Land. I followed the train of King Richard, and mayhap at some of the entertainments given by him you have seen my face. My name is Blondel." "I remember now," the knight said. "I was at Acre the first time I saw you, and if I remember rightly, you can wield the sword as well as the lute." "One cannot always be playing and singing," Blondel said, "and in lack of amusement I was forced to do my best against the infidel, who indeed would have but little respected my art had I fallen into his hands. The followers of the Prophet hold minstrels but in slight reverence." "What is the news of King Richard?" the knight said. "I have heard that he was lost on the voyage homeward." "It is not so," Blondel said. "He landed safely on the coast, and was journeying north with a view of joining his sister at the court of Saxony, when he was foully seized and imprisoned by the Archduke John." "That were gross shame indeed," the knight said, "and black treachery on the part of Duke John. And where is the noble king imprisoned?" "That," said Blondel, "no man knows. On my journey hither I have gathered that the Emperor claimed him from the land of the Archduke, and that he is imprisoned in one of the royal fortresses, but which I know not. And indeed, Sir Knight, since you are well disposed toward him, I may tell you that the purport of my journey is to discover, if I can, the place of his confinement. He was a kind and noble master, and however long my search may be, I will yet obtain news of him." The knight warmly applauded the troubadour's resolution, and was turning to lead him into his abode when his eye fell upon Cuthbert. "Methinks I know the face of your attendant as well as your own, though where I can have seen him I know not. Was he with you in the Holy Land?" "Yes," Blondel said, "the youth was also there, and doubtless you may have noticed him, for he is indeed of distinguished and of good family." "Then let him share our repast," the knight said, "if it seems good to you. In these woods there is no rank, and I myself have long dropped my knightly title, and shall not reassume it until I can pay off my score to the Baron of Rotherheim, and take my place again in my castle." The minstrel and Cuthbert were soon seated at the table with the knight and one or two of his principal companions. A huge venison pasty formed the staple of the repast, but hares and other small game were also upon the table. nor was the generous wine of the country wanting. The knight had several times glanced at Cuthbert, and at last exclaimed, "I have it now! This is no attendant Sir Minstrel, but that valiant young knight who so often rode near King Richard in battle. He is, as I guess, your companion in this quest. Is it not so?" "It is," Cuthbert replied frankly. "I am, like yourself, a disinherited knight, and my history resembles yours. Upon my return to England I found another in possession of the land and titles that belonged to the noble I followed, and which King Richard bestowed upon me. The Earl of Evesham was doubtless known to you, and before his death King Richard, at his request, bestowed upon me as his adopted son, although but a distant connection, his title and lands, and the hand of his daughter. Prince John, who now rules in England, had however granted these things to one of his favorites, and he, having taken possession of the land and title, though not happily of the lady, closed his door somewhat roughly in my face. I found means, however, to make my mark upon him, but as our quarrel could not be fought out to the end, and as the false knight had the aid of Prince John, I am forced for a while to postpone our settlement, and meeting my good friend the minstrel, agreed to join him in his enterprise to discover our lord the king." The knight warmly grasped Cuthbert's hand. "I am glad," he said, "to meet so true and valiant a knight. I have often wondered at the valor with which you, although so young, bore yourself, and there were tales afloat of strange adventures which you had undergone in captivity for a time among the infidels." At Sir Adalbert's request, Cuthbert related the story of his adventures among the Saracens, and then Blondel, turning his lute, sang several canzonets which he had composed in the Holy Land, of feats of arms and adventure. "How far are you," Cuthbert asked presently, when Blondel laid his lute aside, "from the estates which were wrongfully wrested from you?" "But 20 leagues," the knight said. "My castle was on the Rhine, between Koblenz and Mannheim." "Does the Baron know that you are so near?" Cuthbert asked. "Methinks that he does not," the knight replied, "but that he deems me to have gone to the court of the Emperor to seek for redress, which he guesses I shall certainly fail to obtain." "How many men have you with you?" Cuthbert asked. 50 men, all good and true," the knight said. "Has it never entered your thoughts to attempt a surprise upon his castle?" Cuthbert said. The knight was silent for a minute. "At times," he said at length, "thoughts of so doing have occurred to me, but the castle is strong, and a surprise would be difficult indeed." "If the Baron is lulled in security at present," Cuthbert said, "and deems you afar off, the watch is likely to be relaxed, and with a sudden onslaught you might surely obtain possession. Blondel and myself are not pressed for time, and the delay of a few days can make but little difference. If therefore you think we could be of assistance to you in such an attempt, my sword, and I am sure that of my friend, would be at your disposal." The knight sat for some time in silence. "Thanks, generous knight," he said at last. "I am sorely tempted to avail myself of your offer, but I fear that the enterprise is hopeless. The aid, however, of your arm and knowledge of war would greatly add to my chances, and if it pleases you, we will ride tomorrow to a point where we can obtain a sight of the Baron's castle. When you see it, you shall judge yourself how far such an enterprise as you propose is possible." "Is your own castle intact?" Cuthbert asked. "The walls are standing," he said, "but a breach has been made in them, and at present it is wholly deserted." "Do you think," Cuthbert asked, "that if you succeeded in surprising and defeating the garrison of the castle, that you could then regain your own and hold it against your enemy?" "I think that I could," Sir Adalbert said. "The Baron's domains are but little larger than my own. Many of my retainers still live upon the estate, and would, I am sure, gladly join me, if I were to raise my flag. The Baron, too, is hated by his neighbors, and could I inflict a crushing blow upon him, methinks it would be so long a time before he could assemble a force, that I might regain my castle, and put it in an attitude of defense before he could take the field against me. If, Cuthbert said, we could surprise the castle, it might well be that the Baron would fall into your hands, and in that case you might be able to make your own terms with him. How strong a force is he likely to have in his castle? Some 50 or 60 men, the knight replied, for with such a force he could hold the castle against an attack of 10 times their number, and he could in 12 hours call in his retainers, and raise the garrison to 300 or 400 men. Blondel warmly assented to Cuthbert's scheme, and it was settled that at daybreak they should start to view the castle of Rotherheim. At early dawn they were in the saddle, and the 3 rode all day, until toward sunset they stood on the crest of a hill looking down into the valley of the Rhine. The present aspect of that valley affords but a slight idea of its beauty in those days. The slopes are now clad with vineyards, which, although picturesque in idea, are really, to look at from a distance, no better than so many turnip fields. The vines are planted in rows and trained to short sticks, and as these rows follow the declivities of the hillside, they are run in all directions, and the whole mountainside, from the river far up, is cut up into little patches of green lines. In those days the mountains were clad with forests, which descended nearly to the riverside. Here and there, upon craggy points, were situate the fortalices of the barons. Little villages nestled in the woods or stood by the river bank, and a fairer scene could not be witnessed in Europe. That is Rotherheim, the knight said, pointing to a fortress standing on a crag, which rose high above the woods around it. And that, he said, pointing to another, some 4 miles away, similarly placed, is my own. Cuthbert examined closely the fortress of Rotherheim. It was a large building, with towers at the angles, and seemed to rise almost abruptly from the edge of the rock. Inside rose the gables and round turrets of the dwelling place of the Baron, and the only access was by a steep winding path on the riverside. It is indeed a strong place, Cuthbert said, and difficult to take by surprise. A watch no doubt is always kept over the entrance, and there we can hope for no success. The only plan will be to scale the wall by means of a ladder. But how the ladder is to be got to so great a height, I own at present passes my comprehension. After much thought, Cuthbert went on, it might, methinks, be practicable for an archer to approach the walls, and to shoot an arrow over the angle of the castle, so that it would pass inside the turret there, and fall in the forest beyond. If to this arrow were attached a light cord, it could be gained by one on the other side, and a stronger cord hauled over. To this could be attached a rope ladder, and so this could be raised to the top of the wall. If a sentinel were anywhere near, he might hear the rope pulled across the battlements, but if, as we may hope, a watch is kept only over the entrance, the operation might be performed without attracting notice. The knight was delighted with the project, which seemed perfectly feasible, and it was agreed that the attempt should be made. It will need, Sir Adalbert said, an archer with a strong arm indeed to shoot an arrow with a cord attached to it, however light, over the corner of the castle. Methinks, Cuthbert said, that I can do that, for as a lad I was used to the strong bows of my country. The first thing, however, will be to obtain such a bow, but doubtless one can be purchased in one of the towns, which, if not so strong as those to which I was accustomed, will at any rate suffice for us. The party bivouacked in the woods for the night, for the horses had already done a very long journey, and needed rest before starting back for the Black Forest. At daybreak, however, they started, and at nightfall rejoined their band. These were delighted when they heard the scheme that had been set on foot, and all avowed their eagerness to join in the attempt to restore their lord to his rights. 2 days later they set out, having already procured from the nearest town a strong bow, some arrows, a very light rope, and a stronger one, from a portion of which they manufactured a rope ladder capable of reaching from the top of the wall to the rock below. The journey this time occupied 2 days, as the men on foot were unable to march at the pace at which the mounted party had traversed the ground. The evening of the second day, however, saw them in sight of the castle. By Cuthbert's advice, Sir Adalbert determined to give them 24 hours of rest, in order that they might have their full strength for undertaking the task before them. During the day Cuthbert, guided by the knight, made his way through the woods to the foot of the rocks on which the castle stood. They were extremely steep, but could be mounted by active men if unopposed from above. Cuthbert measured the height with his eye from the top of the castle wall to the place which he selected as the most fitting from which to shoot the arrow, and announced to the knight that he thought there would be no difficulty in discharging an arrow over the angle. At nightfall the whole party made their way silently through the woods. 3 men were sent round to the side of the castle opposite that from which Cuthbert was to shoot. The length of light string was carefully coiled on the ground so as to unwind with the greatest facility, and so offer as little resistance to the flight of the arrow as might be. Then, all being in readiness, Cuthbert attached the end to an arrow, and drawing the bow to its full compass, let fly the arrow. All held their breath, but no sound followed the discharge. They were sure, therefore, that the arrow had not struck the wall, but that it must have passed clear over it. Half an hour elapsed before they felt that the cord was pulled, and knew that the men upon the other side had succeeded in finding the arrow and string attached. The stronger cord was now fastened to that which the arrow had carried, and this gradually disappeared in the darkness. A party now stole up the rock and posted themselves at the foot of the castle wall. They took with them the coil of rope ladder and the end of the rope. At length the rope tightened, and to the end they attached the ladder. This again ascended until the end only remained upon the ground, and they knew that it must have reached the top of the wall. They now held fast, and knew that those on the other side, following the instructions given them, would have fastened the rope to a tree upon the opposite side. They were now joined by the rest of the party, and Sir Adalbert leading the way, and followed by Cuthbert and Blondel, began cautiously to ascend the rope ladder. All this time no sound from the castle proclaimed that their intention was suspected, or that any alarm had been given, and in silence they gained the top of the wall. Here they remained quiet until the whole band were gathered there, and then made their way along until they reached the stairs leading to the courtyard. These they descended, and then, raising his war-cry, Sir Adalbert sprang upon the men, who, round a fire, were sitting by the gate. These were cut down before they could leap to their feet, and the party then rushed at the entrance to the dwelling-house. The retainers of the castle, aroused by the sudden din, rushed from their sleeping places, but taken completely by surprise, were unable to offer any resistance whatever to the strong force which had, as if by magic, taken possession of the castle. The surprise was complete, and with scarce a blow struck, they found themselves in possession. The Baron himself was seized as he rose from his bed, and his rage at finding himself in the power of his enemy was so great as for some time to render him speechless. Sir Adalbert briefly dictated to him the conditions upon which only he should desist from using his power to hang him over his own gate. The Baron was instantly to issue orders to all his own retainers and tenantry to lend their aid to those of Sir Adalbert in putting the castle of the latter into a state of defense and mending the breach which existed. A sum of money equal to the revenues of which he had possessed himself was to be paid at once, and the knight was to retain possession of Rotherheim and of the Baron's person until these conditions were all faithfully carried out. The Baron had no resource but to assent to these terms, and upon the following day Cuthbert and Blondel departed upon their way, overwhelmed with thanks by Sir Adalbert, and confident that he would now be able to regain and hold the possession of his estate. End of chapter 25.
Chapter 26 of The Boy Knight, A Tale of the Crusades. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Jeff Reynolds. The Boy Knight, A Tale of the Crusades by G.A. Henty. Chapter 26, King Richard's Return to England. Journeying onward, Blondel and his companions stopped at many castles and were everywhere hospitably entertained. Arriving at Vienna, they lingered for some time, hoping there to be able to obtain some information of the whereabouts of King Richard. Blondel in his songs artfully introduced allusions to the captive monarch and to the mourning of all Christendom at the imprisonment of its champion. These allusions were always well received, and he found that the great bulk of the nobles of the empire were indignant and ashamed of the conduct of the emperor in imprisoning his illustrious rival. The secret of his prison place, however, appeared to have been so well kept that no information whatever was obtainable. "We must carry out our original plan," he said at length, "and journey into the Tyrol. In one of the fortresses there he is most likely to be confined." Leaving the capital, they wandered up into the mountains for weeks, visiting one castle after another. It was no easy matter in all cases to get so near to these prisons as to give a hope that their voice might be heard within, or an answer received without. More than once crossbow bolts were shot at them from the walls when they did not obey the sentinel's challenge and move further away. Generally, however, it was in the daytime that they sang. Wandering carelessly up, they would sit down within earshot of the castle, open their wallets, and take out provisions from their store, and then, having eaten and drunk, Blondel would produce his lute and sing as if for his own pleasure. It needed, however, 4 visits to each castle before they could be sure that the captive was not there, for the song had to be sung on each side. Sometimes they would cheat themselves with the thought that they heard an answering voice, but it was not until the end of the 4th week, when singing outside the castle of Dürnstein, that a full, rich voice, when Blondel ceased, sang out the 2nd stanza of the poem. With difficulty, Blondel and Cuthbert restrained themselves from an extravagant exhibition of joy. They knew, however, that men on the prison wall were watching them as they sat singing, and Blondel, with a final strain taken from a ballad of a knight who, having discovered the hiding-place of his lady love, prepared to free her from her oppressors, shouldered his lute, and they started on their homeward journey. There was no delay now. At times they sang indeed at castles, but only when their store was exhausted, for upon these occasions Blondel would be presented with a handsome goblet or other solid token of the owner's approval, and the sale of this at the next city would take them far on their way. They thought it better not to pass through France, as Philip, they knew, was on the watch to prevent any news of King Richard reaching England. They therefore again passed through Brabant, and so by ship to England. Hearing that Longchamp, Bishop of Ely, one of Richard's vicegerents, was over in Normandy, and rightly deeming him the most earnest of his adherents, they at once recrossed the sea and found the warlike prelate at Rouen. Greatly delighted was he at hearing that Richard's hiding-place had been discovered. He at once sent across the news to England and ordered it to be published far and wide, and himself announced it to the barons of Normandy. Then, with a gorgeous retinue, including Cuthbert and Blondel, he started for Vienna, and arriving there demanded an interview with the emperor. The news that it was now certain that Richard was imprisoned in a castle of the emperor had already spread through Europe, and the bishop had been received everywhere with tokens of sympathy. And so great was the feeling shown by the counts and barons of the empire that the Emperor Henry felt that he could no longer refuse to treat for the surrender of his captive. Therefore he granted the interview which Longchamp demanded. The English envoy was received by the emperor, surrounded by his nobles. The prelate advanced with great dignity. "I come," he said, "in the name of the people of England to demand the restoration of King Richard, most unjustly and unknightly detained a prisoner in his passage through your dominions." "King Richard was my foe," the emperor said, "open and secret, and I was justified in detaining one who is alike my enemy and a scourge to Europe as a prisoner, when fortune threw him in my hands. I am, however, willing to put him to a ransom, and will, upon the payment of 150,000 marks, allow him to go free." I deny your right to detain him or put him to ransom, the bishop said. But as you have the power, so my denial is useless. England is poor, impoverished with war and by the efforts which she made in the service of our holy religion. Nevertheless, poor as she is, she will raise the sum you demand. There is not an Englishman who will not furnish all he can afford for the rescue of our king. But once again, in the presence of your nobles, I denounce your conduct as base and unkingly. The emperor could with difficulty restrain his passion, but the sight of the sombre visages of his nobles showed that they shared in no slight degree the feelings which the English envoy had so boldly announced. Before, however, the emperor said, I surrender King Richard, he must be tried by my peers of many and various crimes of which he is accused. Should he be found guilty of these, no gold can purchase his release. Should he, however, be acquitted, then as my word is given, so shall it be. Although, the prelate said, I deny your right to try our king, and believe that he himself will refuse to accept your jurisdiction, yet I fear not the result if our lord be left in the hands of the nobles of the empire and not in yours. I can trust their honor and courtesy. And turning upon his heel, without another word, he quitted the apartment. An hour later the bishop and his following took horse and rode with all speed to the north coast, and thence sailed for England. The news of the amount of ransom filled the people with consternation, but preparations were at once made for collecting the sum demanded. Queen Eleanor was unceasing in her efforts to raise the money for the release of her favorite son. The nobles contributed their jewels and silver. The people gave contributions of goods, for money was so scarce in England that few had the wherewithal to pay in coin. Prince John placed every obstacle in the way of the collection, but the barons had since their successful stand obtained the upper hand, and it was by intrigue only that he could hinder the collection. In the meantime, popular opinion throughout Europe was strong upon the side of King Richard. The Pope himself wrote to the emperor on his behalf. The barons of the empire were indignant at the shame placed upon their country, and the emperor, although he would fain have thrown further delays in the way, was obliged at last to order the first step to be taken. A solemn diet was ordered to assemble at Worms. Here were collected all the nobles of the empire, and before them King Richard was brought. It was a grand assembly. Upon a raised throne on the dais sat the emperor himself, and beside him and near him were the great feudatories of the empire, and along the sides of the walls were ranged in long rows the lesser barons. When the doors were opened and King Richard entered, the whole assembly, save the emperor, rose in respect to the captive monarch. Although pale from his long confinement, the proud air of Richard was in no way abated, and the eyes that had flashed so fearlessly upon the Saracens looked as sternly down the long lines of the barons of Germany. Of splendid stature and physique, King Richard was unquestionably the finest man of his time. He was handsome, with a frank face, but with a fierce and passionate eye. He wore his mustache with a short beard and closely cut whisker. His short curly hair was cropped closely to his head, upon which he wore a velvet cap with gold coronet, while a scarlet robe lined with fur fell over his coat of mail, for the emperor had deemed it imprudent to excite the feeling of the assembly in favor of the prisoner by depriving him of the symbols of his rank. King Richard strode to the place prepared for him, and then turning to the assembly, he said in a voice which rang through the hall, Counts and lords of the Empire of Germany, I, Richard, King of England, do deny your right to try me. I am a king, and can only be tried by my peers and by the Pope, who is the head of Christendom. I might refuse to plead, refuse to take any part in this assembly, and appeal to the Pope, who alone has power to punish kings. But I will waive my rights. I rely upon the honor and probity of the barons of Germany. I have done no man wrong, and would appear as fearlessly before an assembly of peasants as before a gathering of barons. Such faults as I may have, and none are without them, are not such as those with which I am charged. I have slain many men in anger, but none by treachery. When Richard of England strikes, he strikes in the light of day. He leaves poison and treachery to his enemies, and I hurl back with indignation and scorn in the teeth of him who makes them the charges brought against me. So saying, King Richard took his seat amid a murmur of applause from the crowded hall. The trial then commenced. The accusations against Richard were of many kinds. Chief among them was the murder of Conrad of Montferrat, but there were charges of having brought the crusade to naught by thwarting the general plans, by his arrogance in refusing to be bound by the decision of the other leaders, and by having made a peace contrary to the interests of the crusaders. The list was a long one, but the evidence produced was pitiably weak. Beyond the breath of suspicion, no word of real evidence connecting him with the murder of Conrad of Montferrat was adduced, and the other charges were supported by no better evidence. Many of the German barons who had been at the Crusades themselves came forward to testify to the falsity of these charges, and the fact that Richard had himself placed Conrad of Montferrat upon the throne and had no possible interest in his death was alone more than sufficient to nullify the vague rumors brought against him. Richard himself, in a few scornful words, disposed of this accusation. The accusation that he, Richard of England, would stoop to poison a man whom he could have crushed in an instant was too absurd to be seriously treated. "I am sure," the king said, "that not one person here believes this idle tale. That I did not always agree with the other leaders is true, but I call upon everyone here to say whether, had they listened to me and followed my advice, the crusade would not have had another ending. Even after Philip of France had withdrawn, even after I had been deserted by John of Austria, I led the troops of the Crusaders from every danger and every difficulty to within sight of the walls of Jerusalem. Had I been supported with zeal, the holy city would have been ours, but the apathy, the folly, and the weakness of the leaders brought ruin upon the army. They thought not of conquering Jerusalem, but of thwarting me, and I retort upon them the charge of having sacrificed the success of the crusade. As to the terms of peace, how were they made? I, with some 50 knights and 1,000 followers, alone remained in the Holy Land. Who else, I ask, so circumstanced, could have obtained any terms whatever from Saladin? It was the weight of my arm alone which saved Jaffa and Acre, and the line of seacoast to the cross. And had I followed the example set me by him of Austria and the Frenchmen, not 1 foot of the Holy Land would now remain in Christian hands." The trial was soon over, and without a single dissentient, the King of England was acquitted of all the charges brought against him. But the money was not yet raised, and King Richard was taken back into the heart of Germany. At length, by prodigious exertions, half the amount claimed was collected, and upon the solicitations of the Pope and of the counts of his own empire, the Emperor consented to release Richard upon receipt of this sum, and his royal promise that the remainder should be made up. Not as yet, however, were the intrigues at an end. Prince John and King Philip alike implored the Emperor to retain his captive, and offered to him a larger sum than the ransom if he would still hold him in his hand. Popular opinion was, however, too strong. When the news of these negotiations became bruited abroad, the counts of the empire, filled with indignation, protested against the shame and dishonor being brought upon the country. The Pope threatened him with excommunication, and at last the Emperor, feeling that he would risk his throne did he further insist, was forced to open the prison gates and let the king free. Cuthbert, Blondel, and a few other trusty friends were at hand, and their joy at receiving their long-lost sovereign was indeed intense. Horses had been provided in readiness, and without a moment's delay the king started, for even at the last moment it was feared that the Emperor might change his mind. This indeed was the case. The king had not started many hours, when the arrival of fresh messengers from Philip and John induced the Emperor once more to change his intentions, and a body of men were sent in pursuit of the king. The latter fortunately made no stay on the way, but changing horses frequently, for everywhere he was received with honor and attention, he pushed forward to the coast of the North Sea, and arrived there 2 or 3 hours only before his oppressors. Fortunately it was night, and taking a boat he embarked without a moment's delay, and when the emissaries of the Emperor arrived the boat was already out of sight, and in the darkness pursuit was hopeless. On landing at Dover, the first to present himself before him was Prince John, who, in the most abject terms, besought pardon for the injuries he had inflicted. King Richard waved him contemptuously aside. "Go," he said, "and may I forget your injuries as speedily as you will forget my pardon." Then, taking horse, he rode on to London, where he was received with the most lively acclamation by his subjects. The first step of King Richard was to dispossess all the minions of John from the castles and lands which had been taken from his faithful adherents. Some of these resisted, but their fortresses were speedily stormed. Sir Rudolph was not one of these, Immediately the news of King Richard's arrival in England reached him. Feeling that all was now lost, he rode to the sea-coast, took ship, and passed into France. And Cuthbert, on his arrival at Evesham, found himself undisputed lord of the place. He found that the hiding-place of his mother had not been discovered, and after a short delay to put matters in train, he, attended by a gallant retinue, rode into Wiltshire, to the castle of Sir Baldwin of Bethune. Here he found the Lady Margaret safe and sound, and mightily pleased to see him. She was now 17, and offered no objections whatever to the commands of King Richard that she should at once bestow her hand upon the Earl of Evesham. By the king's order the wedding took place at London, the king himself bestowing the bride upon his faithful follower, whom we may now leave to the enjoyment of the fortune and wife he had so valiantly won. End of chapter 26. End of The Boy Knight, A Tale of the Crusades, by G. A. Henty.